Get out of my way, girl. This section isn't for your kind. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the first-class cabin like a gunshot.
I'm not sure.
But in
these are
that
valid.
moment,
Is
as
there
the
a problem
expensive
with our
uniform
tickets?
split at the seams, 16-year-old Dominique Jackson stood taller than she ever had before. The woman attacking her, Heather Windsor, thought she was humiliating just another black flight attendant who didn't belong in first class. She had no idea she was assaulting the daughter of Alexander Jackson, the billionaire CEO who owned the entire airline. And he was watching everything from just 3 rows back. Heather's perfectly manicured nails dug into the navy blue fabric of Dominique's uniform, ripping it from shoulder to waist as passengers gasped in horror. Yet Dominique's eyes never wavered, her posture never broke. The girl simply looked her attacker in the eyes with a dignity that seemed impossible for her 16 years. Time seemed to freeze in that pressurized cabin at 35,000 feet. Some passengers turned away in embarrassment. Others reached for their phones, sensing that something momentous was unfolding. But no one moved to intervene. No one except the unassuming man in seat 5C, who slowly removed his baseball cap and sunglasses, revealing a face that would change everything. The morning of Dominique Jackson's 16th birthday started like no other in their Manhattan penthouse. While most teenagers her age were planning parties or shopping sprees, Dominique sat across from her father at their marble kitchen island with an unusual request that would change everything. "Dad, I don't want a party," she said, her voice steady but her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the counter. "I want to work as a flight attendant for one day." Alexander Jackson, billionaire CEO of Montgomery Airlines, nearly choked on his coffee. This was his only child, his princess, the girl he'd protected fiercely since her mother's death 5 years ago. His wife Natalie had been a flight attendant when they met one of the few black women working first class in the 1990s. She'd faced discrimination in the skies that would make anyone's blood boil. Yet she'd handled it all with a grace that had captivated him from their first meeting. "Your mother's dream was different," Alexander said, carefully studying his daughter's determined expression. "She faced things I never want you to experience." Dominique's eyes, the same warm brown as her mother's, held his gaze unwavering. "That's exactly why I need to do this, Dad. Mom faced racial injustice on flight so I could have choices. I want to honor her memory by walking in her shoes, even if just for one day." Alexander set down his coffee cup and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The morning light caught the silver threading through his temples, evidence of the stress he'd endured as both CEO and single father. Behind him, the wall displayed photos of Natalie laughing on a beach in Barbados, elegant in her flight attendant uniform, cradling newborn Dominique. "You know what your mother went through," he said finally. "The passengers who refused to take drinks from her hand. The ones who asked for someone else to serve them. The captain who assumed she was cleaning staff instead of crew." Dominique joined him at the window. "Yes, and she still went to work every day with her head held high. She didn't let them break her." Alexander turned to face his daughter. At 16, she was already tall like her mother, with the same elegant posture and quiet confidence. But there was something else there too, a determination that reminded him of himself. "Why now?" he asked. "Why on your birthday?" Dominique touched the small silver wing pin she always wore her mother's first pair from training. "Because Mom was 16 when she decided to become a flight attendant. Because it's been 5 years since we lost her. Because I need to understand what made her who she was." Alexander saw the conviction in his daughter's eyes and recognized it as his own. In the business world, he was known as a man who never backed down from a challenge, who transformed a struggling regional airline into a global powerhouse through sheer force of will. Dominique had inherited that same steel spine. "This isn't about playing dress-up," he said. "The aviation industry has changed, but not enough. People still carry their prejudices on board." I know, Dominique replied. That's why I need to do this. Not just for Mom, but for myself. The conversation that followed would test everything Alexander believed about father-daughter bonding. His instinct was to protect to shield, to use his corporate power and privilege to ensure his daughter never faced the discrimination that had made his wife cry in private. But Dominique's words echoed her mother's philosophy. How will I ever develop resilience in the face of hate if you protect me from everything? She asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. Alexander paced the kitchen, remembering how Natalie had returned from flights, sometimes her smile not quite reaching her eyes, how she'd brush off his concerns with, "It was nothing," even when he could see it was something. How she'd insisted on handling workplace issues herself, refusing his offers to intervene. "Your mother wanted to fight her own battles," he said. "And I want to understand why," Dominique countered. "I want to feel what she felt, see what she saw. Not forever, just for one day." Alexander ran his hand over his face, considering. "The airline has changed since your mother's time. We have anti-discrimination policies, training programs. Policies don't change hearts, Dad. You've said that yourself." It was true. Despite his best efforts, despite the diversity initiatives and zero-tolerance policies he'd implemented, complaints still crossed his desk. Flight attendants of color still faced different treatment than their white counterparts. He'd tried to shield Dominique from that reality, but perhaps that had been a mistake. "Mom always said that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered," Dominique continued. "I want to prove to myself that I have that same strength." Alexander studied his daughter's face, seeing Natalie in every feature. His late wife had been his moral compass, the one who pushed him to make Montgomery Airlines a leader, not just in profits, but in principles. What would she want for their daughter? After an hour of debate, Alexander finally agreed, but with conditions that would prove both wise and heartbreaking. "You handle everything yourself. No special treatment. No one knows who you are. If you're going to do this, you do it right. You prove your empowerment through adversity without my name protecting you." Dominique's eyes lit up with determination. "That's all I want, Dad. To prove I can handle myself." What she didn't know was that Alexander was already planning to book himself on the same flight incognito. He'd honor the agreement not to interfere, but there was no way he'd let his baby girl face potential racist passengers alone, even if she never knew he was there. Later that evening, after Dominique had gone to bed, Alexander sat in his study looking at their family photo album. There was Natalie in her uniform, standing proud at graduation from flight attendant school. There she was on their first date, laughing as she told him about a passenger who'd insisted the plane was flying in the wrong direction. And there, just months before her diagnosis, holding Dominique's hand on her first day of middle school. "Am I doing the right thing, Nat?" he whispered to the empty room. "Would you want her to see this side of the world so young?" The silence held no answers, but Alexander thought he knew what his wife would say. Natalie had never believed in hiding from reality. "The world won't change if we pretend it's already perfect," she'd often told him. He picked up his phone and sent a text to his executive assistant, "Book me on whatever flight Dominique is assigned to. Same day, different name. Make sure I'm within visual distance." The reply came back immediately. "Already done, sir." The next 2 weeks of preparation revealed just how natural a fit Dominique was for her flight attendant dream. Senior crew members at Montgomery Airlines were told only that she was a special trainee, not the CEO's daughter. They watched in amazement as she memorized safety protocols, perfected service standards, and demonstrated the same natural grace that had made her mother legendary among frequent flyers. "You remind me of someone," Sophia Ramirez, a 20-year veteran, told her during training. "There was this attendant back in the day, Natalie. She had this way of handling even the worst discrimination in the skies with such dignity. You have that same spirit." Dominique had to turn away to hide her tears. If only Sophia knew she was training Natalie's daughter. The training center hummed with activity as Dominique moved from one simulation to another. In the mock cabin, she practiced emergency procedures, oxygen masks, evacuation commands, first aid. In the galley training area, she learned to prepare service carts efficiently, memorizing drink orders and meal specifications. "Balance the tray like this," Sophia demonstrated, holding a loaded service tray with seemingly impossible stability. "Your center of gravity is here, not in your hand." Dominique mimicked the stance perfectly on her first try. "Natural talent," Sophia murmured, "just like her." During the customer service scenarios, Dominique faced actors playing difficult passengers. The entitled businessman who refused to turn off his phone, the anxious flyer needing reassurance, the intoxicated traveler making inappropriate comments. "You don't take it personally," Sophia coached. "Remember, they're not seeing you. They're seeing the uniform, the role. Your job is to be professional regardless." "What if they do make it personal?" Dominique asked, thinking of her mother. "What if it's about who I am, not what I'm doing?" Sophia's expression softened. "Then you remember who you are inside. Your value doesn't change because someone can't see it." In the aircraft familiarization session, Dominique learned the layout of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner she'd be working on, where emergency equipment was stored. How to operate the complex door mechanisms, the location of circuit breakers, and medical kits. "You've studied these planes before," the instructor observed as Dominique correctly identified components without hesitation. She smiled. "My mom used to bring home the aircraft manuals. We'd read them together." During meal service training, Dominique learned the elaborate choreography of first-class dining, the precise angle to present wine bottles, the correct way to place silverware, how to describe menu options with both accuracy and appeal. "First class is where you'll face the most scrutiny," Sophia warned during a private moment. "Some passengers believe their ticket price buys them ownership of the crew. You'll need to be twice as professional, twice as patient, and twice as perfect." "Like my Mo, like Natalie?" Dominique caught herself. Sophia nodded, not noticing the slip. "Exactly like Natalie. She never let them see her sweat, never gave them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to her. But..." She hesitated. "But what?" "But I saw her once in the rear galley after a particularly difficult passenger had spent 3 hours making racially charged comments. She stood there perfectly still, taking deep breaths. When I asked if she was okay, she just said, 'I'm not giving him my dignity. It's not for sale.'" Dominique blinked back tears. "She sounds remarkable." "She was," Sophia agreed. "We lost her too soon." On the final day of training, the chief instructor gathered the group for evaluation results. "Most trainees take weeks to reach this level," he said, reviewing Dominique's performance metrics. "You've done it in days. Whatever your goals are in aviation, you have a future here." If only he knew that her only goal was a single day of flight a day to connect with her mother's experience, to honor a legacy that lived in her blood. The morning of the flight arrived with the kind of tension that precedes life-changing moments. As Dominique stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the Montgomery Airlines uniform, she looked exactly like the photos of her mother from decades ago. The same proud posture, the same determination in her eyes, the same readiness to face whatever came her way. Alexander watched from his home office through the security feed, his heart simultaneously swelling with pride and constricting with fear. His wife had faced racial injustice in first class when such discrimination was even more overt. Had things really changed enough? Was he making a terrible mistake letting his daughter do this? "Grace under pressure is your greatest weapon," Dominique whispered to herself, repeating her mother's mantra. "They can try to break you, but you're unbreakable." She smoothed the navy blue jacket, adjusted the silver wing pin, not her mother's treasured original, which she kept safe at home, but an identical replacement Alexander had sourced for her. The skirt fell precisely to her knees. her shoes polished to a mirror shine. Every detail perfect, just as her mother would have expected. In the kitchen, Dominique's overnight bag waited by the door. Though she would only be working, the outbound flight crew regulations required a change of clothes and essential overnight items. Alexander had arranged for a company car to take her home from Miami once her assignment was complete. "Remember," Alexander said, joining her for a final check, still pretending he wouldn't be on the flight. "If anything happens, anything at all, you call me. Promise." "I promise," she said, though they both knew she wouldn't. This was her journey, her test. Alexander handed her a small box. "I was going to save this for dinner tonight, but I think you should have it now." Dominique opened it to find a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny airplane. Inside the plane, visible only when the charm was opened, was a miniature photo of Natalie in her uniform. "She's with you today," Alexander said, his voice thick. "She always is." Dominique hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dad." After Dominique left for the airport, Alexander put on his disguise. The baseball cap and sunglasses were just the beginning. He added a rumpled button-down shirt jeans that had seen better days and worn loafers as far from his usual bespoke suits as possible. A fake wedding ring and reading glasses completed the transformation. His phone buzzed with a message from his executive assistant. "Ms. Jackson has checked in with crew. You're confirmed on Flight 447, Seat 5C. Security has been briefed on your alias, but instructed to maintain absolute discretion." Alexander took a deep breath. This would be the hardest promise he'd ever kept to watch and not intervene if his daughter faced discrimination. But he understood why it mattered to her. Natalie had faced these battles alone every day with no safety net. Dominique needed to know she had that same strength. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time. Gone was Alexander Jackson, billionaire CEO. In his place stood Alex Johnson, unremarkable business traveler. Just another face in the crowd. Just another passenger on Flight 447. The boarding process for Flight 447 began like any other, but the passenger manifest would prove to be a powder keg of personalities. Heather Windsor strutted through first class like she owned it, her designer heels clicking against the floor, her nose literally lifted in the air. At 53, she was the kind of wealthy socialite who believed her money elevated her above basic human decency. What other passengers didn't know was that Heather had filed 12 complaints against flight attendants in just 6 months, always targeting women of color with accusations that barely masked her racist attitudes. She settled into 2A with a theatrical sigh, immediately pressing the call button before even stowing her Hermes handbag. "This seat feels smaller than last time," she announced to no one in particular. "I'm sure they're cutting corners." 3 rows behind her, Alexander Jackson, disguised as Alex Johnson, took his seat in 5C, positioning himself with a clear view of the forward cabin where his daughter would be working. He pretended to be absorbed in a paperback thriller, but his attention remained fixed on the cabin dynamics unfolding around him. Thomas Brooks, a successful black businessman and aviation industry veteran, settled into his first-class seat, 3B, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned his place through decades of hard work. At 60, he'd seen enough discrimination in his lifetime to recognize it instantly. But he'd also learned to pick his battles carefully in predominantly white spaces. He nodded politely to Alexander as he passed 2 black men acknowledging each other in a space where they were the minority. Neither knew the other's true identity. Thomas as the CEO of a major telecommunications company, Alexander as the owner of the very plane they sat in. In economy, Gabriela Morales, 7 months pregnant and traveling alone to meet her husband, struggled with her carry-on. Leo Rodriguez, a kind-hearted teacher from Atlanta, immediately jumped up to help. "Please let me," he offered easily, lifting her bag into the overhead bin. "You should be careful in your condition." "Thank you," Gabriela said gratefully, easing herself into her seat. "My husband was supposed to travel with me, but he got called to his new job early." "Where's he stationed?" Leo asked. Naval Air Station in Key West, she replied proudly. He's an aircraft mechanic. Leo smiled. Then you're in good hands on this flight, probably safer than driving to the grocery store. Meanwhile, the flight crew prepared for departure. Michael Wilson, the 35-year-old lead flight attendant, reviewed the manifest with barely concealed boredom. This was just another day, another flight, another 6 hours of catering to passengers who treated him like a servant. "We've got a trainee today," he told Sofia Ramirez, gesturing toward the galley where Dominique was meticulously checking equipment. "Jackson. She'll shadow you in economy first, then rotate to first for the meal service." Sofia glanced at Dominique with approval. "She's good. Best trainee I've seen in years." Michael shrugged. "Just keep her out of trouble. Last thing we need is complaints." Sofia bristled at his attitude but said nothing. After 20 years in the air, she'd learned to choose her battles carefully. Dominique emerged from the galley, her uniform pristine, her smile professional but warm. She started in economy, helping Gabriella get comfortable, ensuring elderly passengers had everything they needed, her natural warmth immediately winning hearts. "Thank you, sweetheart," an older black woman said, patting Dominique's hand. "You remind me of my granddaughter. So proud seeing you young ones in uniform." The words filled Dominique with purpose. This was why her mother had endured so much to open doors for the next generation, fighting for equality in every space, including the skies. As boarding completed, Dominique assisted with the final checks, demonstrating a thoroughness that impressed even the most experienced crew members. She moved with confidence, her mother's grace evident in every gesture. "You're a natural," Sofia whispered as they prepared the beverage cart. "Like you've been doing this for years." Dominique smiled, thinking of the stories her mother had shared, the unofficial lessons that had seeped into her consciousness since childhood. "I had a good teacher." But the moment Dominique was assigned to rotate through first class, the atmosphere changed like a storm front moving in. Heather Windsor's eyes narrowed the instant she saw the young black attendant enter what she considered her domain. "Since when do they let teenagers serve in first class?" Heather's voice carried that particular tone of privileged status, confronting what it perceived as an intrusion. Sofia, who had been watching protectively, stepped forward. "Ms. Johnson," she caught herself using Dominique's cover name, "is fully qualified to serve all sections of this aircraft." Heather's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched skeptically. "Is she old enough to serve alcohol? She looks like she should be doing homework." Dominique maintained her professional smile, though her heart raced. This was it, the very type of interaction her mother had faced countless times. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm fully certified for all service requirements." Thomas Brooks glanced up from his newspaper, his expression neutral, but his attention now firmly on the interaction unfolding beside him. Alexander gripped his armrest, his knuckles whitening beneath his disguise. Every fiber of his being wanted to intervene to put this woman in her place to protect his daughter. But he had made a promise. This was Dominique's moment to handle on her own. As Dominique moved deeper into first class, the tension followed her like a shadow. Some passengers smiled warmly, others regarded her with the same skepticism as Heather. But Dominique kept her head high, her movements precise, embodying her mother's philosophy, dignity above all. Little did she know that in just 45 minutes that dignity would face its greatest test. "Excuse me," Heather Windsor's voice sliced through the cabin ambiance as Dominique approached with the pre-departure beverage tray. "I specifically asked for the experienced flight attendant." Dominique paused, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I'd be happy to assist you, Ms. Windsor. What can I get for you today?" Heather made a show of looking Dominique up and down, her gaze lingering judgmentally on the young woman's face. "How long have you been doing this job? A week?" "I'm fully trained and certified," Dominique replied evenly, avoiding the specifics of her unique situation. "Would you care for a pre-departure beverage? We have champagne orange juice or water." "I doubt you know the difference between champagne and sparkling wine," Heather said, loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Bring me Sophia," I want someone who knows what they're doing. Thomas Brooks lowered his newspaper slightly, his attention now fully captured by the exchange. Alexander shifted in his seat, forcing himself to remain in character despite the rising anger he felt. Sophia, who had been monitoring from nearby, stepped forward smoothly. Is there a problem? Heather gestured dismissively toward Dominique. I prefer to be served by someone with experience. No offense to the trainee. The pause before trainee hung in the air, loaded with unspoken implications. Ms. Johnson is providing excellent service to our first-class passengers, Sophia replied firmly. I'm supervising, but she's fully capable of handling your requests. Dominique stood perfectly still, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Never let them see you flinch? Fine. Heather sighed dramatically. I'll have the champagne. The real champagne, not whatever you usually serve to people who don't know any better. Dominique nodded. Of course, Ms. Windsor. We're serving Veuve Clicquot today. A flicker of surprise crossed Heather's face. Clearly, she hadn't expected Dominique to know the brand. At least they taught you the names, she muttered. As Dominique moved to retrieve the champagne, she passed Thomas, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. It was a small gesture, but it bolstered her resolve. When she returned with the perfectly poured champagne, Heather accepted it without acknowledgement, immediately turning her attention to her phone as if Dominique had ceased to exist. Will there be anything else, Ms. Windsor? Dominique asked. Just some competent service for the remainder of the flight, Heather replied without looking up. Do you think you can manage that? I'll certainly do my best, Dominique answered, her voice steady despite the deliberate provocation. Michael Wilson, observing from the galley, approached Dominique as she stepped away from Heather's seat. Don't engage with her more than necessary, he advised quietly. Some passengers just want to create drama. Is that what we call it? Dominique asked, her tone careful. Drama, Michael shrugged. Call it what you want. Just don't give her ammunition. These premium passengers pay our salaries. Dominique noted his use of these with a mental clarity that would have made her mother proud. The subtle categorization, the implicit hierarchy, these were the invisible currents her mother had navigated daily. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Dominique continued her rotation through first class, providing impeccable service to each passenger. Many responded warmly, impressed by her professionalism, but Heather's eyes followed her every move, narrowed with disapproval. When did they lower the standards? Heather whispered loudly to the passenger beside her, a middle-aged white man who looked uncomfortable with her commentary. I remember when flight attendants had to meet certain criteria. Alexander clenched his jaw, pretending to be absorbed in his book. He'd heard comments like this throughout his career, the thinly veiled racism that people thought they could get away with when they believed no one important was listening. It took every ounce of his self-control not to identify himself and put Heather Windsor in her place. Thomas Brooks, however, had reached his limit. Excuse me, he said, turning slightly toward Heather. I couldn't help overhearing. What criteria exactly are you referring to? Heather blinked, caught off guard by the direct challenge. Well, experience, obviously, professionalism, maturity. Interesting, Thomas replied. Because from what I've observed, the young lady is exhibiting all those qualities admirably. Heather flushed. You're entitled to your opinion. As are you, Thomas said pleasantly, though perhaps with less volume. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as Dominique continued her duties, moving with the practiced efficiency she'd inherited from her mother. But the encounter with Heather had only just begun, and the worst was yet to come. In the galley, Sophia squeezed Dominique's shoulder supportively. You're handling her beautifully. Don't let her shake you. Dominique nodded, thinking of her mother facing these same battles day after day, year after year. I won't. Your mom would be proud, Sophia said, then caught herself. I mean, whoever taught you would be proud. Dominique smiled, the irony bittersweet. Thank you. That means more than you know. As Dominique prepared to serve the first-class meal service, Heather's antagonism evolved from passive-aggressive comments to more direct confrontation. When Dominique approached to set her table, Heather deliberately placed her elbow in the way. "Oh, am I making your job difficult?" Heather asked with false concern when Dominique politely asked her to adjust her position. "I thought you were supposed to work around the passengers, not the other way around." "A slight adjustment helps us serve you better," Dominique explained patiently. "Thank you for your understanding." "Understanding seems to be a one-way expectation," Heather replied, grudgingly moving her arm. "You people always want accommodation." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers glanced up, the racial undertone unmistakable. Alexander's hand tightened around his book, the pages crumpling slightly in his grip. Thomas Brooks set his jaw, his earlier intervention apparently forgotten by Heather. Dominique, however, maintained her composure. "Today's first course is a citrus salad with champagne vinaigrette," she announced, placing the appetizer before Heather with perfect form. "Would you prefer still or sparkling water with your meal?" "Sparkling. European, not domestic," Heather specified, clearly attempting to catch Dominique in some perceived inadequacy. "And make sure the glass is properly chilled this time." "Of course," Dominique replied, moving to the next passenger. The meal service progressed smoothly until Dominique returned with Heather's sparkling water. As she leaned to place the glass on the table, Heather shifted suddenly, causing Dominique to wobble slightly. The water sloshed, spilling a few drops onto Heather's designer sleeve. "Look what you've done," Heather exclaimed loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This is a $3,000 blouse." "I apologize for the spill," Dominique said, immediately reaching for a napkin. "Let me help." "Don't touch me," Heather snapped, recoiling. "You've done enough damage. Where's your supervisor? This level of incompetence is unacceptable." Michael Wilson appeared immediately, his expression professionally concerned, but his eyes communicating that Dominique should step back. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" "This girl," Heather emphasized the word with disdain, "just ruined my designer blouse with her carelessness. I want her removed from first class immediately." Michael turned to Dominique. "What happened?" Before Dominique could explain, Thomas Brooks spoke up. "The passenger moved suddenly as the drink was being served," he stated matter-of-factly. "I was watching. It was hardly the flight attendant's fault." "Of course you'd defend her," Heather said dismissively. "But I know what I experienced." Alexander shifted in his seat, his disguise suddenly feeling suffocating. The scene unfolding before him was exactly what he'd feared, his daughter being subjected to the same treatment that had broken his wife's heart so many times. Michael looked uncomfortable, caught between defending his crew member and appeasing a difficult first-class passenger. "Perhaps you could assist in economy for a while," he suggested quietly to Dominique. "That's right. Send her back where she belongs," Heather said with a triumphant smile. "First class requires a certain standard." Dominique felt a flash of the anger her mother must have suppressed countless times, but her voice remained steady. "I'm happy to continue wherever I'm needed." Sophia approached, having overheard the exchange. "I need Dominique's assistance with the meal service," she said firmly. "As the senior flight attendant, I believe she's performing excellently." Michael hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Continue as assigned, then. Ms. Windsor, I'll personally ensure your blouse is compensated through our customer care department." "It's not about the money," Heather insisted, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's about maintaining standards. When I pay for first class, I expect first-class service from appropriate personnel." The loaded word appropriate wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Gabriela Morales, who had come forward to use the first-class lavatory due to her pregnancy, lingered in the aisle, her expression troubled by what she was witnessing. As Dominique continued serving, Heather deliberately made each interaction more difficult, dropping her napkin repeatedly, changing her drink order multiple times, requesting items not on the menu. "I specifically requested the gluten-free option when I booked," she claimed, though her name was flagged with no such request. "I'd be happy to check if we have any alternatives available," Dominique offered. "Don't bother." Heather sighed dramatically. "I'll just go hungry. Some of us are used to making sacrifices when others fail to meet basic expectations." Leo Rodriguez, who had come forward to check on Gabriella, overheard this last comment and frowned deeply. As an educator, he recognized bullying behavior when he saw it. "Excuse me," he said quietly to Dominique as she passed. "You're doing a wonderful job. Some people bring their unhappiness wherever they go." His kindness almost broke through Dominique's professional facade, reminding her of the humanity that her mother had always said was the true reward of her job, the good passengers who recognized flight attendants as people, not servants. "Thank you," she whispered, genuinely touched. As the meal service concluded, tension in the cabin remained high. Heather had created a palpable atmosphere of discomfort, with other passengers exchanging glances of disapproval or embarrassment at her behavior. Alexander watched his daughter navigate this minefield with growing pride. She was every inch Natalie's daughter, maintaining dignity in the face of deliberate provocation. But he also recognized the building pressure behind Heather's attacks. This wasn't merely a difficult passenger. This was a woman with an agenda looking for confrontation. And as Heather pressed the call button for the 5th time in 20 minutes, Alexander knew the confrontation was about to reach its breaking point. "I need to speak to someone in charge immediately," Heather demanded when Dominique answered her call button. "This meal was completely inadequate for first class. I want to see the options you're serving in business." "I'm sorry the meal didn't meet your expectations," Dominique replied. "However, the business class menu is different and I can't bring those items to first class." "Why not?" Heather challenged. "Afraid they might be better than what you've served us? Or is there another reason you don't want to go back there and check?" The implication was clear. Heather was suggesting Dominique belonged in the back of the plane, not in first class. "It's airline policy," Dominique explained patiently. "Each cabin has its specifically designed menu. I'd be happy to note your feedback for our culinary team." "Your policy seems awfully convenient," Heather said, making air quotes with her fingers. "I want to speak to the captain about this." "I've been a platinum member for 15 years, and I've never been treated so dismissively." Michael Wilson approached, having overheard the escalating conversation. "Is there a problem?" "Yes," Heather said before Dominique could respond. "This girl is refusing a simple request to see the business class menu options. I'm beginning to think there's a personal reason she's being so difficult with me." "Ms. Johnson is following standard procedure," Michael explained, though his tone lacked conviction. "Each cabin's service is predetermined." "So you're taking her side?" Heather's voice rose. "Is that how Montgomery Airlines treats its highest-tier passengers now, prioritizing inexperienced staff over loyal customers?" Passengers throughout the cabin were now openly watching the confrontation. Thomas Brooks set his tablet aside, his full attention on the scene unfolding. Alexander shifted to the edge of his seat, every muscle tense with the effort of restraining himself from intervention. "No one is taking sides," Michael assured her quickly. "Customer satisfaction is our priority. What can we do to improve your experience today?" Heather pointed directly at Dominique. "You can remove her from first class. I don't feel comfortable with her serving me." "Based on what grounds?" Sophia asked, joining the conversation with a professional but firm tone. "Based on her attitude, her incompetence, and her obvious bias against me," Heather declared. "Just look at how she's standing there judging me." Dominique, who had maintained a neutral expression throughout, blinked in surprise at the accusation. "I assure you I'm not—" she began. "Don't interrupt me," Heather snapped, rising suddenly from her seat. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. No respect for passengers, no understanding of proper service etiquette." The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet as other passengers watched the confrontation escalate. Gabriela Morales, who had returned to first class to use the lavatory again, placed a protective hand over her pregnant belly, as if shielding her unborn child from the ugliness of the moment. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Michael requested, his voice strained. "Not until this is addressed," Heather insisted, stepping into the aisle directly in front of Dominique. "I want her removed, or I'll be contacting your corporate office the moment we land." "Ms. Windsor," Dominique said calmly, channeling every ounce of her mother's grace under pressure, "I understand you're upset. How can I make your flight more comfortable within our service guidelines?" "You can start by knowing your place," Heather hissed, her voice low but venomous. A collective intake of breath rippled through the cabin. The racial undertone was no longer subtle. It was explicit. Thomas Brooks half rose from his seat, his patience evidently exhausted. "Madam, that comment was entirely inappropriate." "Stay out of this," Heather snapped without looking at him. Her attention remained fixed on Dominique, her eyes blazing with an irrational anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Alexander gripped his armrest so hard his knuckles turned white. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stand up, to reveal himself, to put an end to this before it went any further. But the promise he'd made to his daughter held him in place. This was her moment to face her battle to fight, just as Natalie had fought hers. "Ms. Windsor," Dominique said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'm simply doing my job according to our airline standards. If you have concerns about our service, we have formal channels for feedback." "Your job," Heather's voice rose again. "Your job is to serve passengers properly, not to stand there with that look on your face like you somehow belong up here with the rest of us." The mask of civility had completely fallen away now, revealing the naked prejudice beneath. Several passengers audibly gasped. Leo Rodriguez, who had come forward again to check on Gabriela, stopped in the aisle, his expression hardening at Heather's words. "That's enough," Sophia stated firmly. "Ms. Windsor, you need to return to your seat now." "Or what?" Heather challenged, her voice shrill. "You'll throw me off the plane at 35,000 feet. She laughed bitterly, then turned back to Dominique. "You think that uniform makes you special, that it changes anything about who you really are?" Time seemed to slow down as Heather reached out suddenly, her manicured fingers grasping the collar of Dominique's perfectly pressed uniform. "This doesn't belong on you." The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the cabin as Heather yanked downward, ripping Dominique's uniform jacket from collar to waist. Buttons scattered across the aisle as the pristine navy material split open, exposing the white blouse underneath. For one eternal moment, the entire cabin froze in shock. Then chaos erupted. "Oh my God!" Gabriela cried out, her hands covering her mouth. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Thomas Brooks demanded, fully standing now. Michael Wilson stood paralyzed, clearly unprepared for this level of assault. But Dominique herself remained oddly still, her posture straight, her eyes locked with Heather's. In that moment, she was purely her mother's daughter, refusing to grant her attacker the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She didn't try to cover herself. She didn't cry out. She simply stood dignified in her torn uniform, letting the reality of what had just occurred register with every witness. "People like you need to be reminded," Heather spat, still gripping the torn fabric. "First class isn't for everyone." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Heather seemed momentarily stunned by her own actions, her fingers slowly releasing the ruined uniform. Sophia was the first to recover quickly, removing her own jacket and placing it around Dominique's shoulders. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Dominique nodded, once her eyes never leaving Heather's face. "I'm fine." It was a lie, of course. She wasn't fine. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling beneath the borrowed jacket. But in that moment she understood exactly what her mother had endured, and why maintaining dignity had been her greatest weapon. "You've just assaulted a crew member," Sophia informed Heather, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. That's a federal offense. It was an accident, Heather claimed immediately, though no one in the cabin believed her. I barely touched her. The uniform must be cheaply made. Leo Rodriguez had his phone out recording. I've got it all, he said. Every word, every action. Heather spun toward him. You have no right to film me. And you had no right to put your hands on her. Thomas Brooks countered, his deep voice resonating with authority. Michael finally found his voice. Ms. Windsor, return to your seat immediately. This incident will be reported to the authorities upon landing. This is ridiculous, Heather protested, though a flicker of uncertainty had entered her eyes as she registered the unified disapproval surrounding her. I'm the victim here. She provoked me. By existing in first class, Thomas asked pointedly. Is that the provocation you're referring to? As Heather sputtered indignantly, Alexander Jackson had reached his breaking point. The sight of his daughter standing tall in a torn uniform, so eerily reminiscent of stories Natalie had told him years ago, shattered his resolve to remain anonymous. Some promises, he decided, were meant to be broken. Alexander Jackson rose from his seat, removing his baseball cap and sunglasses in one fluid motion. The transformation was immediate and startling, from nondescript passenger to commanding presence. Even his posture changed: shoulders, straightening chin, lifting eyes, sharpening with focused intensity. That's my daughter you just assaulted, he stated, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to authority. A wave of confusion swept through the cabin, followed by dawning recognition among the crew members. Mr. Jackson? Michael Wilson's face drained of color as he recognized the CEO. Heather Windsor turned slowly, her expression shifting from righteous indignation to uncertainty. What are you talking about? Who are you? Alexander Jackson, he replied evenly, stepping into the aisle, CEO and majority owner of Montgomery Airlines. And that young woman you just assaulted is my daughter, Dominique Jackson. The revelation hit the cabin like a physical force. Sophia's eyes widened in shock as she looked between Alexander and Dominique, suddenly understanding why the girl had seemed so familiar. You're Natalie's daughter, she whispered. I should have seen it immediately. Dominique nodded slightly, her composure still intact despite the dramatic turn of events. Heather's face contorted through a series of emotions: disbelief, confusion, and then the first flickers of fear. This is some kind of setup, she accused, her voice less certain now. A publicity stunt? A setup? Thomas Brooks echoed incredulously. You believe someone tore their own uniform and subjected themselves to public humiliation as a stunt. You deliberately provoked me, Heather insisted, though her argument sounded hollow even to her own ears. Alexander moved forward, his presence commanding the space without effort. What my daughter did, Ms. Windsor, was her job with more professionalism and dignity than you deserved. What you did was commit assault motivated by racial prejudice, witnessed by a cabin full of passengers and recorded on multiple devices. Michael Wilson seemed to shrink with each passing second, suddenly aware of how his reluctance to firmly support Dominique would appear to the company's CEO. Sir, I was just about to. Not now. Alexander cut him off, his tone making it clear that a reckoning would come later. Heather's demeanor was rapidly shifting from aggression to defensive maneuvering. Mr. Jackson, this is clearly a misunderstanding. If I'd known she was your daughter. Then what? Alexander challenged. You would have treated her with basic human decency. The fact that you're making that distinction proves exactly what kind of person you are. Dominique stepped forward, still wearing Sophia's jacket over her torn uniform. Dad, I can handle this. The simple statement, quiet but firm, refocused the entire cabin's attention. Despite everything that had happened, Dominique remained centered, her dignity intact. I know you can, Alexander said with unmistakable pride. But you shouldn't have to. No one should. Leo Rodriguez, still recording, moved slightly closer. Sir, for the record, your daughter handled herself with incredible professionalism throughout this entire incident. Ms. Windsor was provocative from the start. Gabriella nodded emphatically. It's true. I witnessed multiple instances of harassment before this escalated. Thomas Brooks stood beside Alexander, now the two successful black businessmen presenting a united front. What we all witnessed today wasn't a misunderstanding, Thomas stated. It was a textbook example of the discrimination that occurs daily, usually without witnesses or consequences. Heather looked increasingly cornered, her gaze darting between faces, seeking any ally and finding none. This is completely unfair. I'm being ganged up on because of one regrettable incident. One, Sophia interjected. I've been watching you target Dominique since she entered first class. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of sustained harassment. Alexander turned to Michael. Contact the captain. Inform him we'll need law enforcement meeting the aircraft upon landing. His tone made it clear this was not a suggestion. Michael nodded quickly. Yes, sir, right away. As Michael hurried toward the cockpit, Heather's composure finally cracked. You can't do this to me. Do you have any idea who I am? My husband plays golf with 3 members of your board. Perhaps you should call him, Alexander suggested calmly. I'm sure he'd be interested to know what his wife has been up to today. Dominique stepped closer to her father, her voice low. Dad, I wanted to handle this myself. And you did, he assured her, for far longer than most adults would have managed. What happened today wasn't your failure. It was the failure of a system that still allows people like Ms. Windsor to believe their money grants them immunity from basic human decency. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an incident in the cabin, we will be diverting to Charleston International Airport, where we'll be met by authorities. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We anticipate landing in approximately 20 minutes. A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers processed this development. Heather sank back into her seat, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. This is completely unnecessary, she protested, though with notably less conviction. I'm willing to apologize if that's what it takes to resolve this. An apology might have sufficed before you physically assaulted my daughter, Alexander replied. Now it's a matter for the authorities. Sophia guided Dominique toward the galley. Come with me. I have a spare blouse in my bag that should fit you. As they stepped away, Alexander turned to address the cabin at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your travel today. Montgomery Airlines will ensure everyone reaches their final destination, regardless of connections missed due to this diversion. My staff will be contacting each of you personally to arrange compensation for the inconvenience. The response from the cabin was surprisingly supportive. Several passengers nodded in understanding, a few even offered quiet applause. Thomas Brooks extended his hand to Alexander. Thomas Brooks, Horizon Telecommunications. Alexander shook it firmly. I know who you are, Mr. Brooks. Your reputation precedes you. As does yours, Thomas replied. Though I admit I didn't recognize you in that baseball cap. That was the point, Alexander said with a rueful smile. I promised Dominique I wouldn't interfere with her experience today. I wanted her to prove to herself she could handle whatever came her way. From what I observed, she more than proved that, Thomas noted. You have an extraordinary daughter. Alexander's expression softened with pride. She's her mother's daughter in every way that matters. As the plane began its descent toward Charleston, Dominique returned to the cabin in a borrowed blouse, her posture still impeccable, her expression composed. The torn uniform jacket had been carefully folded and placed in an airline garment bag, evidence of what had transpired, but also a symbol of something more, the visible cost of invisible battles fought daily by people like her mother. Alexander watched his daughter resume her duties, checking seatbelts and securing the cabin for landing despite everything that had happened, and he knew with absolute certainty that Natalie would be proud beyond words. The jetway at Charleston International Airport was lined with uniformed officers when Flight 447 finally docked at the gate. The captain had radioed ahead with details of the incident, and airport police had responded with appropriate seriousness to an assault on a flight crew member. As the door opened, Michael Wilson greeted the authorities with visible relief. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly." The lead officer, a stern-faced woman with the name Captain Rivera on her badge, stepped aboard. "We understand there was an assault on a crew member." Before Michael could respond, Alexander Jackson appeared beside him. "Yes, Captain. My daughter was physically assaulted by a passenger who took exception to her presence in first class." Captain Rivera's eyebrows rose slightly as she registered who was speaking. "Mr. Jackson, I wasn't informed the airline CEO was aboard." "I was traveling privately," Alexander explained. "But the victim is my daughter Dominique Jackson, who is working as a flight attendant today." Understanding dawned in Captain Rivera's expression. "I see. And the alleged assailant, Heather Windsor, Seat 2A, Michael provided. She tore Ms. Jackson's uniform in an unprovoked attack." Captain Rivera nodded to her officers, who moved past them into the cabin. "We'll need statements from all witnesses, and we'll need to examine any video evidence." "Multiple passengers recorded the incident," Alexander confirmed, "and I believe the aircraft security cameras would have captured it as well." As the officers proceeded to first class, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Heather Windsor sat rigidly in her seat, her earlier bluster replaced by tight-lipped silence as she saw the police approaching. "Ms. Windsor," Captain Rivera addressed her directly, "I need you to gather your belongings and come with us. You're being detained for questioning regarding an alleged assault on a flight crew member." "This is absurd," Heather protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "It was a misunderstanding, a minor altercation at most." Thomas Brooks spoke up from his seat. "Officer, I witnessed the entire incident. There was nothing minor about it. Ms. Windsor deliberately grabbed and tore the flight attendant's uniform after making numerous racially charged comments." Leo Rodriguez stepped forward. "I have video of the assault," he offered, holding up his phone, "and the harassment that preceded it." Captain Rivera nodded to one of her officers. "Please collect that evidence and take a statement from this gentleman." As Heather was escorted from the aircraft, her face flushed with humiliation, passengers throughout the cabin watched in solemn silence. For many, this was the first time they'd witnessed someone facing immediate consequences for behavior that too often went unpunished. Dominique stood in the galley, observing the proceedings with composed dignity. Sophia remained beside her, a protective presence that reminded Alexander of the countless times senior flight attendants had sheltered Natalie from similar situations. "Are you okay?" Alexander asked his daughter quietly. Dominique nodded. "I understand now," she said. "What Mom dealt with, why she never wanted to talk about it at home." Alexander's throat tightened with emotion. "She wanted to protect you from this reality for as long as possible." "But she couldn't protect me forever," Dominique replied. "No one can. That's why I needed to experience it for myself, to know I could face it with the same strength she did." Their conversation was interrupted as Captain Rivera approached. "Ms. Jackson will need your statement as well, and will need to document the damage to your uniform as evidence." "Of course," Dominique agreed. "Whatever you need." As Dominique followed the officer to give her statement, Alexander found himself approached by the flight's captain, James Bennett, who had left the cockpit once the aircraft was secured. "Mr. Jackson," Captain Bennett began awkwardly, "I want to personally apologize for what happened today. Had I been informed earlier—" "That's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Alexander interrupted. "The fact that it required my presence, my position for this incident to be taken seriously." Captain Bennett had the grace to look discomforted. "Sir, I assure you." "Save the assurances for the press conference we'll undoubtedly need to hold." Alexander set his tone, making it clear the conversation was over. Outside, the aircraft word was spreading rapidly. Passengers disembarking with phones in hand were already posting about the incident on social media. Hashtag Montgomery assault and hashtag first-class racism were trending within minutes. In the terminal, a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered, drawn by the unusual police presence at the gate. Among them, airport employees whispered as they recognized Alexander Jackson escorting his daughter through the terminal. "That's the CEO," one baggage handler murmured to another. Something big must have happened. Media alerts began pinging on phones throughout the airport. Local news outlets sensing a story were already dispatching reporters. By the time Alexander and Dominique reached the private lounge where they'd been directed to wait, the first news vans were pulling up outside the terminal. Inside the lounge, Dominique finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. "I didn't think it would feel like this," she admitted, her voice slightly unsteady for the first time. "Like what?" Alexander asked gently. "So personal," she replied. Mom always made it sound clinical, like it was something she observed happening to her rather than something she felt. Alexander took his daughter's hand. That was her way of processing it, of maintaining control. She never wanted you to know how deeply it cut. "But you knew." Alexander nodded solemnly. "I saw it in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. I heard it in her voice when she'd call from layovers. I felt it in the way she'd hold me a little tighter after certain flights." A knock at the door interrupted them as Thomas Brooks entered, followed by Captain Rivera. "Sorry to intrude," Thomas said. "I've given my statement, but I wanted to check on you both before I continue my journey." "Mr. Brooks," Alexander acknowledged with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for speaking up today. Too few people do." "I've been that person too many times, the one who saw but stayed silent," Thomas admitted. "It doesn't sit well with the conscience." Captain Rivera cleared her throat. "Ms. Jackson, we've collected statements from 12 passengers and 3 crew members. The evidence is overwhelming. Ms. Windsor is being charged with assault interference with a flight crew and potentially hate crime enhancements pending review by the prosecutor's office." "Hate crime?" Dominique repeated, sounding startled. "Her comments before the assault make the racial motivation clear," Captain Rivera explained. "And given the current federal emphasis on prosecuting bias-motivated incidents in commercial aviation, the U.S. Attorney's Office has expressed immediate interest in the case." As this information sank in, Dominique's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed Sophia Ramirez. "May I take this?" she asked Captain Rivera, who nodded. "Sophia," Dominique answered. "Dominique." Sophia's voice was filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say, I should have recognized you immediately. You look so much like her. Natalie was my mentor when I started flying. She's the reason I survived my first year." Tears welled in Dominique's eyes. "She never told me that." "There's so much she probably never told you," Sophia said. "She protected everyone around her, her trainees, her flying partners, her family. But today, watching you stand there with that same strength, it was like seeing her again." As Dominique spoke with Sophia, Alexander's own phone was inundated with notifications. The Montgomery Airlines public relations team board members, legal counsel, all demanding information, all requiring immediate decisions. One message in particular caught his attention from the head of HR. "Preliminary review of complaint records shows Heather Windsor has filed similar complaints against 8 crew members in the past year, all women of color. Previous management dismissed as customer preference. Recommend full investigation." Alexander felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about one racist passenger. It was about a system that had enabled her behavior perhaps for years. He looked up to find Thomas Brooks watching him thoughtfully. "You're thinking beyond today, aren't you?" Thomas observed. Alexander nodded. "This incident exposed something that's been hiding in plain sight. The question is what to do about it." Thomas handed him a business card. "When you're ready to have that conversation, call me." What happened to your daughter has happened to countless others without cameras recording or CEOs witnessing. Perhaps this is the moment to address the larger pattern. As Alexander accepted the card, Captain Rivera approached again. Mr. Jackson, we've arranged for transportation to take you and your daughter wherever you need to go. Ms. Windsor will remain in custody pending arraignment. Thank you, Captain, Alexander replied. And the other passengers. Montgomery Airlines is sending another aircraft to continue the journey to Miami. It should arrive within the hour. Alexander nodded, already formulating next steps. This incident would not be buried in customer service reports or dismissed as an isolated occurrence. What had happened to Dominique, what had happened to Natalie countless times, would become a catalyst for change. As he watched his daughter complete her call with Sophia, her composure restored and her determination evident. Alexander knew that this day had transformed her in ways neither of them had anticipated. She had set out to honor her mother's memory by walking in her shoes. Instead, she had found her own path forward, one that might finally address the injustice her mother had faced silently for years. The torn uniform, carefully preserved as evidence, would become more than proof of one woman's prejudice. It would become a symbol of the invisible battles fought daily by those deemed to be in the wrong place by people who believed they had the right to decide who belonged where. And as father and daughter prepared to leave the airport, their private trauma already transforming into a public reckoning. The first headlines began appearing on news sites across the country. CEO's daughter assaulted on flight in apparent racist attack. The story was just beginning. The Montgomery Grand Hotel's executive conference room buzzed with unusual energy as CEOs and senior executives from 8 major airlines gathered around the massive oak table. 6 days after the incident on Flight 447, the video had accumulated over 30 million views across platforms, igniting a conversation about discrimination in commercial aviation that showed no signs of diminishing. Alexander Jackson and Thomas Brooks had strategically seated themselves opposite each other, rather than side by side, creating the impression of a balanced discussion rather than a united front. The subtle positioning wasn't lost on the other executives who recognized the political maneuvering at play. Thank you all for adjusting your schedules on such short notice, Alexander began. I think we all understand why this conversation can't wait. James Mitchell, CEO of Atlantic Airways, leaned forward with a practiced expression of concern. First, Alexander, let me say how disturbed we all were by what happened to your daughter. Completely unacceptable behavior from that passenger. Several heads nodded in rehearsed agreement. Thomas Brooks allowed a moment of silence before speaking. While the sympathy is appreciated, gentlemen, and I note there's only one woman among the 14 executives present, which is perhaps part of the larger conversation we need to have. We're not here to discuss one incident. We're here to address a pattern across our entire industry. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as executives exchanged glances. This wasn't going to be the damage control session some had anticipated. What pattern exactly are you suggesting? Asked William Turner of Western Pacific Airlines, his tone carefully neutral. Alexander slid folders across the table to each participant. Over the past week, Montgomery Airlines has conducted an internal audit of our complaint handling procedures. What we discovered was deeply troubling, a consistent pattern of dismissing, downgrading, or reclassifying complaints involving discriminatory behavior, particularly when those complaints involved high-value customers. As the executives opened their folders, Thomas continued the 1-2 punch. Horizon Telecommunications has been collecting data on passenger experiences across airlines for a market research initiative. When we cross-referenced complaints related to discriminatory treatment with official airline responses, we found an industry-wide discrepancy that cannot be explained by coincidence. The room remained silent as the implications sank in. These weren't vague accusations. These were data-driven revelations that could potentially expose every airline represented to significant legal and public relations challenges. Elena Rivera, the lone female CEO present, representing Suncoast Airlines, was the first to respond. "I appreciate your transparency, Alexander. And while I can't speak for others, I can acknowledge that Suncoast has room for improvement in this area. The question is, what concrete steps are you proposing?" Before Alexander could answer, the conference room door opened and Sofia Ramirez entered, followed by 3 other flight attendants from different airlines, a deliberate representation of frontline perspectives. "I've invited these crew members to join us," Alexander explained, "because any solution developed without input from those most directly affected will be inadequate at best." The addition of crew members to an executive-level meeting was unprecedented, and the discomfort among some CEOs was palpable. This was not how these discussions typically proceeded. "With respect," William Turner objected, "some of the matters we need to discuss involve sensitive corporate policies that aren't appropriate for the very people those policies impact most directly." Thomas interrupted smoothly. "That mindset is precisely what created this situation, Mr. Turner. Decisions made in rooms exactly like this one, excluding the voices of those who live with the consequences." Over the next 2 hours, the conversation evolved from defensive positioning to reluctant acknowledgement to finally constructive dialogue. Sophia and the other flight attendants shared experiences that clearly resonated beyond their individual airlines: the unwritten rules about appeasing certain passengers, the fear of reporting incidents, the lack of support from management when they did stand firm against discriminatory behavior. "The issue isn't a lack of formal policies," Sophia explained. "Every airline represented here has anti-discrimination statements. The issue is implementation. What happens when those policies conflict with revenue priorities?" Alexander built upon this foundation, outlining a 3-point proposal developed in consultation with Thomas and other industry veterans. First, a standardized system for tracking and addressing discrimination complaints with transparent reporting, accessible to regulatory agencies and the public. Second, revised training protocols for all customer-facing staff, emphasizing both their right and responsibility to enforce respectful treatment standards regardless of a passenger's status. Third, and most controversially, an industry-wide agreement to share information about passengers with documented patterns of discriminatory behavior similar to existing security watch lists. "You're essentially proposing a blacklist based on behavioral complaints," observed James Mitchell, his tone skeptical. "The legal implications alone are far less significant than the legal implications of continuing to enable discriminatory behavior," Thomas countered. "Or have we forgotten that Ms. Windsor is currently facing federal charges that could have been prevented if her previous pattern of behavior had been properly addressed?" The debate continued, with executives raising concerns about implementation costs, potential customer backlash, and competitive disadvantages if adoption wasn't universal. Yet gradually, the momentum shifted toward acknowledgement that some form of coordinated response was necessary, if not from ethical conviction, then from pragmatic recognition of changing public expectations. As the meeting concluded, 7 of the 8 airlines represented had committed to participate in a joint task force to develop formal recommendations, with only Western Pacific declining to join immediately. In the hallway outside the conference room, Alexander found himself approached by Elena Rivera. "That was impressive maneuvering," she said quietly. "Getting us all in the room before anyone could formulate a unified pushback strategy." Alexander smiled slightly. "Sometimes leadership requires creating momentum before resistance can organize." "Your daughter," Elena continued. "How is she handling all this?" "Better than anyone could reasonably expect," Alexander replied. "She's already thinking beyond her own experience, focusing on how to create meaningful change." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to meet her sometime. Young women with that kind of clarity and purpose are rare." "I think she'd appreciate that," Alexander agreed. She's beginning to understand the importance of visible role models in traditionally exclusive spaces. As the executives dispersed, Sophia and the other flight attendants remained behind with Alexander and Thomas debriefing on the outcomes and next steps. The mood was cautiously optimistic, not naive about the challenges ahead, but encouraged by the unprecedented cooperation emerging from a painful catalyst. "Do you think they'll actually follow through?" one of the flight attendants asked skeptically. "Some will," Thomas replied. "Others will wait to see which way public opinion solidifies. But the important thing is that the conversation has moved beyond platitudes to specific commitments with measurable outcomes." Alexander checked his watch, noting the time. "I need to head back. Dominique is speaking at her school assembly this afternoon." Sophia looked surprised. "She's addressing her school about what happened." "About more than that from what she's told me," Alexander said with evident pride. "She's using the platform to talk about the broader issues of belonging and exclusion in spaces like her private school." As they parted ways, the impact of Flight 447 continued to ripple outward from a personal trauma to a corporate reckoning to an industry-wide conversation. And at the center of these expanding circles, a 16-year-old girl was finding her voice not just as a victim of discrimination, but as an advocate for change that her mother would have been proud to witness. Meanwhile, across town, Dominique stood in the wings of her school auditorium, waiting to address her peers. The nervous flutter in her stomach wasn't just public speaking anxiety, it was the weight of responsibility. The understanding that her words could either reinforce sympathy for her individual experience or expand awareness of a much larger pattern affecting countless others. "You belong wherever you choose to stand," she whispered to herself, channeling her mother's strength as she prepared to step into the spotlight not just as Alexander Jackson's daughter or the girl from the viral video, but as herself, Dominique Jackson, finding purpose in pain and determined to create meaning from what had happened to her on Flight 447. "Accountability without action is just performative," Alexander Jackson declared, standing before a packed press conference at Montgomery Airlines headquarters. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 447, and the company was finally ready to unveil its comprehensive response. Behind him, a diverse group of executives, flight attendants, and industry representatives created a visual statement of collaborative commitment. Among them stood Dominique, poised and confident in a navy blue dress that subtly echoed a flight attendant's uniform, a deliberate choice that hadn't escaped notice from the assembled media. "Today, Montgomery Airlines is announcing the Jackson Initiative," Alexander continued, "a multifaceted program designed to address discrimination in air travel at every level from passenger behavior to crew training to corporate policy." He outlined the initiative's core components. First, a complete overhaul of how discrimination complaints were categorized, tracked, and addressed with quarterly public reporting of aggregate data. Second, mandatory training for all staff, not just flight crews, but gate agents, customer service representatives, and management on recognizing and responding to discriminatory behavior. Third, a passenger code of conduct with clear consequences for violations regardless of the passenger's status or spending level. Fourth, the creation of an independent oversight board comprised of civil rights experts, industry veterans, and passenger advocates to ensure accountability and continuous improvement. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander emphasized, we're establishing a scholarship program in honor of Natalie Jackson, my late wife and Dominique's mother, who served as a flight attendant on these very routes for 15 years, often facing the same discrimination that our daughter experienced. At the mention of her mother, Dominique felt a wave of emotion. This aspect of the initiative had been her suggestion, transforming pain into opportunity for others. The Natalie Jackson Scholarship will provide full education funding for children of flight attendants pursuing careers in aviation hospitality or civil rights law, Alexander explained. Because long-term change requires not just policies, but people committed to a more equitable future. As the press conference continued, reporters pressed for specifics on how the initiative would be implemented and measured. Alexander fielded most questions, but occasionally deferred to Sophia Ramirez or Thomas Brooks, who had joined as a strategic partner through Horizon Telecommunications. When a reporter directly addressed Dominique, "How do you feel about this initiative bearing your family name?" she stepped forward with composed confidence. "The Jackson Initiative isn't about my family's name," she replied thoughtfully. "It's about acknowledging that what happened to me happens to countless others who don't have the platform I've been given. My mother faced similar discrimination throughout her career, often without cameras recording or CEOs witnessing. This initiative honors her resilience and extends it to everyone who deserves dignity in these shared spaces." Her articulate response earned appreciative nods from the assembled executives. At 16, Dominique was demonstrating a poise and perspective that belied her years, further evidence of Natalie's lasting influence. Following the press conference, the real work began. Alexander had assembled a dedicated team to implement the initiative led by Sophia Ramirez, who had been promoted to the newly created position of Vice President of Passenger Equity and Crew Advocacy. "Your first priority," Alexander instructed Sophia and her team, "is conducting a comprehensive review of every discrimination complaint filed in the past 3 years. I want to know how they were handled, what patterns exist, and who made the decisions to dismiss or downgrade legitimate concerns." Sophia nodded, understanding the magnitude of the task. "We've already begun preliminary analysis. The results are illuminating." "Illuminating is a polite word for disturbing," added Vanessa Rodriguez from HR, who had joined Sophia's team. "We're finding that complaints were routinely reclassified based on the passenger's membership tier. Platinum members' behavior was almost never categorized as discriminatory, regardless of the evidence." Alexander's expression hardened. "I want names. Every executive who authorized this approach, every manager who implemented it. This wasn't just a system failure, it was individual decisions made by people who prioritized revenue over respect." The accountability aspect of the initiative proved most challenging. Some long-serving executives resisted the implication that they had enabled discrimination, arguing they were simply following established customer service protocols. "With all due respect, sir," protested Senior Vice President James Wilson during a particularly tense meeting, "what you're characterizing as enabling discrimination was standard practice across the industry. Premium passengers receive additional consideration, that's the nature of the business." "Additional consideration in service delivery is appropriate," Alexander countered firmly. "Additional tolerance for abusive behavior is not. And let's be clear about what additional consideration often meant in practice, allowing wealthy passengers to request crew members based on appearance, race, or accent without calling it what it was: discrimination." The internal resistance gradually subsided as evidence mounted and public support for the initiative grew. Flight attendant unions across multiple airlines issued statements endorsing Montgomery's approach and calling on other carriers to adopt similar measures. Meanwhile, Dominique had embarked on her own parallel project, working with her school to develop a student-led diversity and inclusion council. Her experience had highlighted the subtle ways privilege and exclusion operated even in educational environments, and she was determined to address these patterns before they became entrenched professional behaviors. "The passengers who discriminate against flight attendants today were students in classrooms yesterday," she observed during a planning meeting with faculty advisors. "If we want to change behavior in premium cabins, we need to start with conversations in classrooms." 3 weeks into the initiative's implementation, Alexander received an unexpected call from Elena Rivera, the Suncoast Airlines CEO who had attended the initial industry meeting. "Your daughter's speech at her school has gone viral," Elena informed him. "Someone recorded it and posted it online. You might want to take a look." Alexander found the video easily. It had already accumulated over 2 million views. Dominique stood at a podium addressing her school assembly, speaking with remarkable clarity about how privilege operates in everyday interactions. "What happened to me on that flight wasn't just about one woman's prejudice," she told her peers. "It was about a lifetime of messages telling her she belonged in first class and people who looked like me didn't." Those messages don't begin in airports. They begin in places like this, in who gets called on in class, who feels welcomed on teams, who sees themselves represented in leadership. Alexander watched with a mixture of pride and awe as his 16-year-old daughter articulated concepts that many adults struggled to grasp. She wasn't just repeating talking points. She was synthesizing her personal experience with deeper structural insights. "She's extraordinary," Elena commented when Alexander called her back. "And she's making your initiative much more than a corporate response to bad publicity. She's giving it moral authority." "She gets that from her mother," Alexander replied, the familiar pride in his voice tinged with wistfulness. Natalie had that same ability to cut through complexity to the heart of an issue. As the Jackson initiative gained momentum, other airlines began announcing their own programs, some substantive, others more superficial. The competitive nature of the industry ensured that no carrier wanted to be perceived as less committed to addressing discrimination than their rivals. Thomas Brooks leveraged this dynamic skillfully, using Horizon Telecommunications' market position to encourage genuine reform rather than performative gestures. "We're developing a passenger equity rating system," he informed Alexander during their weekly strategy call. "Similar to safety ratings, but focused on how effectively airlines handle discrimination complaints and protect crew member dignity." "That's brilliant," Alexander acknowledged. "Nothing motivates this industry like comparative metrics that consumers can easily understand." 6 weeks after Flight 447, the landscape of commercial aviation was showing tangible signs of transformation. Montgomery Airlines had completed retraining for 80% of customer-facing staff, implemented the new complaint tracking system, and published its first transparency report, a document that acknowledged historical failures while committing to measurable improvements. Other carriers were following suit with varying degrees of sincerity and effectiveness, but the collective momentum was undeniable. Industry publications featured cover stories on the equity revolution in air travel, and major news outlets continued to monitor developments with sustained interest. Throughout this period, Dominique maintained her focus on education and awareness rather than personal publicity. When offered exclusive interviews by major networks, she instead suggested they feature veteran flight attendants like Sophia, whose perspectives encompassed decades of experience with discrimination. "This isn't about making me a symbol," she explained to her father when he questioned her reluctance to accept certain high-profile opportunities. "It's about changing systems, not celebrating individuals." Alexander recognized in her approach echoes of Natalie's humble determination. His wife had never sought recognition for her quiet advocacy within the airline, preferring to measure success in policy changes rather than personal accolades. 2 months after the incident, as the Jackson Initiative transitioned from urgent response to sustained implementation, Alexander found Dominique in his home office late one evening studying the framed photo of Natalie in her flight attendant uniform. "Do you think she'd approve of how we've handled this?" Dominique asked softly. Alexander considered the question thoughtfully. "Your mother wasn't interested in publicity or grand gestures. She cared about real change however it came about. So yes, I think she'd approve, especially of how you've used your platform to amplify others' voices rather than just telling your own story." Dominique nodded, her expression reflective. "I have a meeting tomorrow," she said, "with Amanda Windsor." Alexander raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Heather's daughter. Are you sure that's wise?" "She's not her mother," Dominique replied with quiet certainty. "And she reached out again with an idea I think has merit. Something about breaking cycles of prejudice at their source." As Alexander watched his daughter's determined expression, he recognized that the Jackson Initiative had evolved beyond his corporate response into something more profound, a catalyst for conversations and connections that crossed traditional boundaries, creating possibilities for change that extended far beyond the confines of airplane cabins. And perhaps that was the most fitting tribute to Natalie's memory, not just addressing the discrimination she had faced, but nurturing the next generation of advocates who would continue the work she had begun. In Dominique, that legacy was clearly thriving. The upscale coffee shop near Columbia University buzzed with the animated conversations of students and professors engaged in the intellectual discourse that defined campus life. At a corner table, Dominique Jackson sat across from Amanda Windsor, an unlikely meeting that would have seemed impossible 2 months earlier. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Amanda said, her posture reflecting the poised confidence of a law student, though her eyes revealed uncertainty about how she would be received. "I wasn't sure you'd respond to my message." "I almost didn't," Dominique admitted candidly. "But your email was compelling." Amanda's message had outlined a proposal for using her mother's case as a teaching tool in law schools, examining the intersection of aviation regulations, civil rights statutes, and behavioral accountability in commercial spaces. But beneath the academic framing, Dominique had sensed something more personal driving Amanda's interest. "Before we discuss your proposal," Dominique said, "I'm curious about something. You mentioned breaking cycles of prejudice. What did you mean exactly?" Amanda's carefully maintained composure wavered slightly. "That's fair. I owe you context before asking for collaboration." She took a deep breath. "Growing up with my mother was an education in privilege and prejudice. I witnessed behaviors that I didn't have the framework to identify as wrong until I was much older." "What kind of behaviors?" Dominique asked, her tone neutral rather than accusatory. "Countless small moments," Amanda explained. "The way she'd speak loudly and slowly to service workers with accents. How she'd demand to speak to someone else when assisted by people of color in high-end stores. The comments she'd make in the car after encounters with black professionals questioning their qualifications or suggesting they'd benefited from lowered standards." Dominique listened intently, recognizing patterns that extended far beyond her own experience on Flight 447. "I absorbed these attitudes without questioning them," Amanda continued, "until my sophomore year at Princeton when my roommate, a brilliant black woman from Detroit, called me out on a comment I made. I'd suggested she was different from other black students, and she refused to let that microaggression pass unchallenged." "That must have been uncomfortable," Dominique observed. "Intensely," Amanda agreed. "But necessary. She didn't just call me out, she educated me, made me see the water I'd been swimming in my entire life without noticing. That began my awakening to how deeply I'd internalized my mother's prejudices." The conversation paused as their coffee arrived. Dominique studied Amanda thoughtfully, recognizing the courage it took to confront one's own conditioning, especially when it came from a parent. "So, what changed for you?" Dominique asked after a moment. "Beyond that initial confrontation, everything," Amanda replied simply. "I started reading critical race theory, personal narratives, historical accounts. I joined campus discussions I would have avoided before. I began examining my own reflexive thoughts and assumptions. And gradually, I started to see how privilege had shaped not just my mother's worldview, but my own." "And your mother's reaction to this evolution?" Amanda's expression tightened. "She was dismissive at first, then increasingly hostile. She called my professors indoctrinators and my new friends influences. Our relationship deteriorated to the point that we barely spoke during my last 2 years of undergraduate study." "Yet you still came to her arraignment," Dominique noted. "She's still my mother," Amanda said quietly. "And while I condemn her actions unequivocally, I also understand the environments and influences that shaped her. That's not an excuse, just context that helps me maintain some compassion while rejecting her behavior." Dominique nodded, appreciating the nuance in Amanda's perspective. "You mentioned a proposal in your email." "Yes," Amanda replied, visibly relieved to move toward more structured territory. "I've been developing a curriculum for privileged youth specifically targeting children from wealthy, predominantly white families like mine. It's designed to interrupt the transmission of prejudice before it becomes deeply internalized. She outlined her concept an educational initiative that would combine experiential learning, historical context, and facilitated conversations with people from different backgrounds. The program would focus on children aged 12 to 17, old enough to engage with complex ideas, but young enough that harmful attitudes weren't yet fully calcified. "I'm calling it the Windsor Accountability Project," Amanda explained. "Using my own family name is deliberate, acknowledging that this work begins with confronting my own legacy." "Why are you telling me this?" Dominique asked, genuinely curious. "It sounds like you've already developed the concept." "Because your perspective is essential," Amanda replied earnestly. "Any program designed to address prejudice needs input from those who've experienced its impact. And because," she hesitated briefly, "because your response to what my mother did has been so remarkably measured and constructive. You've focused on structural change rather than personal vengeance." Dominique considered this thoughtfully. "I had good models for that approach. My mother faced discrimination throughout her career but channeled her response into advocacy rather than bitterness. My father built an entire business empire by addressing structural barriers rather than just individual obstacles." "Exactly," Amanda nodded. "That's the perspective I want to incorporate into this program. Not just identifying what's wrong, but constructively addressing root causes." As their conversation continued, Dominique found herself increasingly engaged with Amanda's vision. The Windsor Accountability Project represented something she hadn't anticipated, a parallel effort to the Jackson Initiative that approached the same problem from the opposite direction. While her father's work focused on protecting those experiencing discrimination, Amanda's proposed to prevent discrimination at its source. "What resources do you have for implementation?" Dominique asked eventually. Amanda's expression turned both determined and slightly uncomfortable. "That's complicated. I have a trust fund that becomes accessible when I turn 30 or immediately for educational initiatives. My grandfather established it with different values than my mother's. I'm in the process of petitioning the trustees to release funds for this project." "And if they decline, then I'll find another way," Amanda stated with quiet certainty. "This matters too much to abandon because of financial constraints." Dominique recognized in Amanda's determination echoes of her own resolve. Despite their vastly different backgrounds and experiences, they shared a commitment to addressing injustice that transcended personal circumstances. "I'd like to help," Dominique decided. "Not just with input, but with connections. My father has established relationships with educational consultants through the Natalie Jackson Scholarship Program. They might provide valuable guidance on curriculum development and implementation strategies." Relief and gratitude washed over Amanda's face. "That would be incredible. I wasn't sure how you'd respond given that your mother assaulted me," Dominique finished directly. "You're not responsible for her actions. And frankly, the fact that you've chosen to create something constructive from this situation says more about your character than your last name ever could." As their meeting concluded, plans were made for future collaboration. What had begun as a tentative conversation between unlikely allies was evolving into a partnership with potential for significant impact. 3 weeks later, Amanda stood before the trustees of her family foundation, presenting a formal proposal for the Windsor Accountability Project. Beside her stood Dominique Jackson, not required for the presentation, but present by choice as a powerful symbol of collaborative purpose. "The Windsor name has recently become associated with prejudice and entitlement," Amanda told the soberly attentive trustees. "This project represents an opportunity to transform that legacy to acknowledge past harm while creating future change." The trustees' questions were probing and occasionally skeptical. Why focus on privileged youth rather than those experiencing discrimination? How would success be measured? What safeguards would ensure appropriate content for different age groups? Amanda addressed each question with well-researched responses, her legal training evident in her structured thinking and persuasive articulation. When appropriate, she deferred to Dominique, acknowledging her lived experience and perspective. "Ms. Jackson," one trustee asked directly, "given your personal history with the Windsor family, why support this initiative?" Dominique met the question with composed thoughtfulness. "Because lasting change requires addressing both symptoms and causes. My father's work with the Jackson Initiative focuses on protecting those experiencing discrimination and holding accountable those who perpetrate it. The Windsor Accountability Project complements that approach by interrupting the development of prejudice before it manifests in harmful actions." Her response, mature beyond her years, visibly impressed the trustees. The contrast between Dominique's poised 16-year-old presence and the media images of her torn uniform created a powerful narrative of transformation and purpose. At the conclusion of the presentation, the trustees voted unanimously to fund the Windsor Accountability Project's pilot program with a commitment to review results after 1 year for potential expansion. Outside the foundation offices, Amanda turned to Dominique with genuine emotion. "Thank you. Your presence made all the difference." "The project has merit on its own," Dominique replied, "but sometimes symbols matter as much as substance. Having us stand together represented possibility, the idea that reconciliation and progress can emerge from conflict." As they parted ways, each returning to their respective spheres, Amanda to law school, Dominique to high school, neither could have fully anticipated how their unexpected alliance would continue to evolve. But both understood that they had created something significant, a tangible pathway for transforming a moment of discrimination into a movement for education and awareness. Meanwhile, in a federal detention facility awaiting trial, Heather Windsor received notification of the trustees' decision regarding her daughter's project. Her reaction, a mixture of indignation and bewilderment, revealed how completely she had failed to comprehend the implications of her actions, or the determination of those committed to ensuring such behavior faced appropriate consequences and constructive responses. "She's using our family name for this," Heather demanded of her attorney during their next consultation. "With that girl involved, this is betrayal, pure and simple." Richard Coleman sighed wearily, having grown accustomed to his client's inability to recognize her circumstances. "Ms. Windsor, with respect, your daughter is creating something positive from an extremely negative situation. The trustees clearly see value in the initiative." "They've been manipulated," Heather insisted. "Can't you file something to stop this? It's my family's foundation." "Actually, it's not," Coleman corrected gently. "It's your father's foundation, and the trustees have full discretion over educational initiatives. Furthermore, any legal action against your daughter's project would only generate additional negative publicity, which would hardly help your case." As Heather struggled to comprehend how completely control had slipped from her grasp, her reputation, her freedom, even her family legacy, now directed toward purposes she opposed. Amanda and Dominique were already scheduling their first curriculum development session. The Windsor Accountability Project and the Jackson Initiative had become complementary forces addressing the same fundamental issue from different directions, one focused on response and protection, the other on prevention and education. Together, they represented a comprehensive approach to transforming the patterns of privilege and prejudice that had culminated in that moment on Flight 447, when a uniform was torn, but a movement was born. The federal courthouse in Charleston hummed with anticipation as spectators and media representatives filled every available seat. 3 months had passed since the incident on Flight 447, and Heather Windsor's trial had finally begun after multiple procedural delays engineered by her defense team. Dominique sat beside her father in the front row behind the prosecution table, her posture poised, but her eyes revealing the emotional weight of revisiting the traumatic experience. Alexander maintained a protective presence, occasionally squeezing his daughter's hand in silent support. Across the aisle, Amanda Windsor sat alone, having chosen to attend despite opposition from her mother's legal team. Her decision to witness the proceedings firsthand, not in support of Heather, but as personal accountability for the Windsor family legacy, had further strained their already fractured relationship. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Gonzalez rose for her opening statement, her manner confident but measured. "This case is about more than a torn uniform," she began. "It's about the deliberate violation of federal aviation safety regulations, the intentional interference with crew member duties, and, most disturbingly, an assault motivated by racial animus." As Gonzalez outlined the prosecution's case, she emphasized the substantial evidence supporting their charges: multiple witness statements, video recordings from several angles, and Heather's documented history of filing complaints against crew members of color. "The evidence will show that Ms. Windsor's actions were not merely rude or inconsiderate, but deliberately discriminatory and potentially dangerous," Gonzalez concluded. "Aircraft cabins are confined spaces where crew members must maintain authority to ensure passenger safety. By undermining that authority through assault and racist intimidation, the defendant created a threat to everyone on that flight." Defense attorney Richard Coleman approached his opening statement with careful strategy, acknowledging the basic facts while disputing the prosecution's interpretation of motive. No one disputes that an altercation occurred. He conceded, his tone reasonable and slightly regretful. What the prosecution has mischaracterized is the context and intent. Ms. Windsor, a long-time premium traveler with legitimate service expectations, reacted impulsively to what she perceived as inadequate attention to first-class passengers. Her reaction was inappropriate. We freely admit this, but it was not racially motivated. His attempt to reframe the incident as a customer service dispute rather than a hate crime drew skeptical expressions from several jurors who had already seen the widely circulated video. "Most critically," Coleman continued, "the prosecution has failed to acknowledge that Ms. Windsor's complaint history shows dissatisfaction with service quality across demographics, not targeted discrimination as they've alleged." As the trial proceeded into witness testimony, the prosecution built a methodical case. Sofia Ramirez described the pattern of escalating harassment she had observed throughout the flight. Thomas Brooks recounted Heather's increasingly explicit racial comments. Leo Rodriguez presented his video recording, which captured not just the assault itself, but Heather's damning statement, "People like you need to be reminded, first class isn't for everyone." Each testimony piece reinforced the prosecution's narrative of deliberate racially motivated harassment, culminating in physical assault. Throughout, Heather maintained a carefully composed expression, though her hands frequently clenched into fists beneath the defense table. On the third day, Dominique took the stand. As she was sworn in, the courtroom fell into expectant silence. This was the moment many had been waiting for: the victim's direct testimony about her experience. "Ms. Jackson," began Assistant U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, "could you describe for the court your role on Flight 447? Dominique's voice remained steady as she explained the special training arrangement, her desire to honor her mother's legacy, and her father's presence on the flight. She recounted the escalating tension with Heather Windsor with remarkable clarity, neither embellishing nor minimizing the interactions. When asked about the moment of assault, Dominique's composure wavered only slightly. "I felt her grab my uniform collar. There was a moment of pressure, then the sound of tearing fabric. I remember thinking that I needed to stay calm to maintain my dignity regardless of what happened next. That's what my mother would have done." Coleman approached cross-examination cautiously aware of the potential backlash from aggressive questioning of a sympathetic teenage victim. "Ms. Jackson, you've testified that you were serving as a trainee that day, correct?" "Yes," Dominique confirmed. "And this was your first experience working in first class?" "Yes, though I had completed all required training for that service level." Coleman nodded thoughtfully. "Would you agree that first-class service has specific standards that differ from other cabins?" "Certainly," Dominique replied. "More personalized attention, enhanced meal service, greater flexibility in addressing passenger requests." And my client, Ms. Windsor, was expressing dissatisfaction with service elements throughout the flight, was she not? Dominique considered this carefully. She expressed dissatisfaction, yes, but not with service elements, with my presence specifically. She requested Sophia instead of me multiple times, referred to my appearance as inappropriate for first class, and made comments about people like me not belonging there. Coleman's strategy of portraying the incident as a service complaint rather than racial discrimination was faltering against Dominique's precise recollections and composed delivery. No further questions, he concluded, returning to the defense table, where Heather whispered furiously in his ear, clearly displeased with his inability to undermine Dominique's testimony. The prosecution's final witness delivered perhaps the most damaging testimony. Michael Wilson, the lead flight attendant who had initially hesitated to fully support Dominique during the incident, had agreed to testify as part of a separation agreement with Montgomery Airlines. "Mr. Wilson," Gonzalez began, "were you aware of any policies at Montgomery Airlines regarding the handling of passenger complaints with potential discriminatory elements?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. There was an unofficial understanding among senior crew and management that certain high-value passengers received special consideration regarding their preferences. What kind of preferences? Sometimes it involved seating arrangements, meal priorities, or, he hesitated, crew assignments. "Could you elaborate on crew assignments?" Gonzalez pressed. "If certain passengers had complained previously about specific types of crew members, we would try to assign different personnel to their section when possible." "And by specific types, you mean crew members of particular racial or ethnic backgrounds?" "Yes," Michael admitted reluctantly, though it was never stated explicitly in those terms. The language used was customer comfort or service style matching. This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. Alexander's expression darkened as he heard direct confirmation of the discriminatory practices his internal investigation had uncovered. "Was Ms. Windsor known to have such preferences?" Gonzalez asked. "Yes. She had filed multiple complaints specifically about crew members of color. She was flagged in our system as someone who should ideally be served by particular staff. And yet on Flight 447, Dominique Jackson was assigned to first class where Ms. Windsor was seated." "Yes, it was a training rotation and those flags wouldn't have applied to a special arrangement like Dominique's training day." "What happened when you saw Ms. Windsor becoming aggressive with Ms. Jackson?" Michael's discomfort increased visibly. "I hesitated. Based on past practice, I was inclined to accommodate Ms. Windsor by reassigning Dominique rather than confronting the behavior directly. Because Ms. Windsor was a high-value passenger. Yes, and because addressing discriminatory behavior was discouraged when it involved premium customers. We were trained to de-escalate by accommodation rather than confrontation." This testimony proved pivotal not just for establishing Heather's history of discriminatory behavior, but for revealing the institutional practices that had enabled and even reinforced such behavior over time. During cross-examination, Coleman attempted to distance Heather from these corporate policies. "Mr. Wilson, did Ms. Windsor ever explicitly request to not be served by black flight attendants?" "Not in those exact words," Michael acknowledged. "The complaints were always framed as service issues, but the pattern was unmistakable when viewed collectively." "So you're interpreting her intent rather than testifying to explicit statements?" "I'm describing a pattern that was recognized and accommodated by airline management, including myself," Michael replied. "The intent was clear enough that we had specific protocols for handling her flights." As the prosecution rested its case, the defense faced a significant challenge. The evidence against Heather was substantial, and attempts to reframe her actions as service complaints rather than racial discrimination had been systematically undermined by witness testimony and video evidence. Coleman's opening statement for the defense case sought to shift focus to Heather's personal circumstances. Her history of anxiety in travel situations, her medication that may have affected her judgment, her previously unblemished legal record. Ms. Windsor deeply regrets the altercation that occurred, he told the jury. But we ask you to consider whether this momentary lapse in judgment, however inappropriate, rises to the level of federal criminal charges rather than civil liability. The defense called several character witnesses, country club associates, charity committee members, and former colleagues who testified to Heather's generosity and community involvement. However, under cross-examination, each was forced to acknowledge they had never observed her interactions with service personnel of color in stressful situations. The question of whether Heather would testify created visible tension at the defense table. Coleman clearly advised against it, but Heather appeared increasingly frustrated with the proceedings and determined to present her own perspective. Ultimately, against her attorney's advice, Heather took the stand, a decision that would prove catastrophic to her defense. Initially, she maintained the composed, contrite demeanor Coleman had clearly coached, expressing regret for the misunderstanding while denying any racial motivation. But under Gonzalez's methodical cross-examination, Heather's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Ms. Windsor, you've stated that your reaction was about service quality, not race. Yet, multiple witnesses heard you say, "People like you need to be reminded. First class isn't for everyone." What did you mean by people like you? I meant inexperienced trainees, Heather insisted, people without proper training. And yet, Ms. Jackson had completed all required training for first-class service as confirmed by multiple witnesses. What made you assume she was inadequately trained? She just didn't seem to fit the role. Heather replied, her frustration becoming evident. Fit the role how exactly, in terms of skills, knowledge, or something else? She seemed out of place. Heather snapped, her composure slipping. First class has certain standards, certain expectations. Not everyone belongs there. And who decides who belongs? Ms. Windsor, is it airline policy or passengers like yourself? People who pay thousands for first class expect a certain environment, Heather declared, her voice rising. We shouldn't have to explain that. A certain environment, Gonzalez repeated thoughtfully. Could you elaborate on what that environment includes? Or perhaps more relevantly, what it excludes? The trap was set, and Heather walked directly into it. Look, I expect professionalism, experience, and appropriate presentation. When I'm paying premium prices, I shouldn't be served by someone who looks like they belong in coach. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Coleman closed his eyes briefly, recognizing the damage his client had just done to her own defense. And what exactly does someone who belongs in coach look like, Ms. Windsor? Gonzalez pressed her tone deceptively gentle. Belatedly recognizing her error, Heather attempted to backtrack. That's not what I meant. I was referring to training and experience, not appearance. Yet you made this judgment about Ms. Jackson before she had served you in any capacity, before you had any opportunity to assess her training or experience. What visible factor informed that immediate judgment? The question hung in the air, Heather's silence more damning than any answer could have been. In the gallery, Amanda Windsor watched her mother's testimony with an expression of resigned sadness. This public unraveling confirmed what she had privately acknowledged years ago. Her mother's prejudices were so deeply ingrained that even under oath, facing serious legal consequences, she couldn't fully disguise them. Closing arguments crystallized the fundamental narratives of the case. The prosecution presented Heather's actions as the manifestation of a pattern of discrimination enabled by corporate policies prioritizing revenue over respect. The defense portrayed her as an imperfect individual who had reacted inappropriately to perceived service issues deserving of civil consequences but not criminal penalties. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict guilty on all charges, including the hate crime enhancement that significantly increased potential sentencing severity. As the verdict was read, Dominique reached for her father's hand. The outcome brought a complex mixture of emotions, not triumph or satisfaction, but a sobering recognition of accountability finally being applied where it had too often been absent. Across the aisle, Amanda stood quietly as her mother was taken into custody pending sentencing. Their eyes met briefly, Heather's filled with accusation, Amanda's with resolved sadness. The gulf between them had become unbridgeable, not because Amanda had abandoned her mother, but because she had chosen to confront the values that had led to this moment rather than perpetuating them. Outside the courthouse, media representatives swarmed for statements. Alexander and Dominique addressed the press briefly, focusing on the broader implications rather than personal vindication. Today's verdict affirms that discriminatory behavior has consequences regardless of one's social or economic status, Alexander stated. But a single conviction doesn't solve the underlying issues. The real work continues through initiatives like the Jackson Initiative and the Windsor Accountability Project, addressing both response and prevention. As reporters called for Dominique's reaction, she stepped forward with characteristic poise. This case was never about one incident or one individual. It was about recognizing patterns that have been normalized for too long and committing to change them. That work doesn't end with today's verdict, it's only beginning. Their measured response stood in stark contrast to the sensationalized coverage the case had initially received. Rather than celebrating a win, they had framed the outcome as a step in an ongoing journey toward more equitable treatment in spaces where discrimination had historically been tolerated or even enabled. As they departed the courthouse, Thomas Brooks approached to offer congratulations and support. "Justice was served today," he observed. "But we all know the real challenge lies ahead, transforming this moment into lasting change." Alexander nodded in agreement. The legal system addressed one symptom. Our work must address the underlying causes. Dominique, watching Amanda Windsor speak briefly with her mother's attorney before departing alone, recognized that the courtroom drama represented both an ending and a beginning. The judicial process had reached its conclusion, but the work of transformation, personal, corporate, and cultural, was just beginning to unfold. 1 year after the incident on Flight 447, the expansive conference center at Montgomery Airlines headquarters buzzed with purposeful energy. Representatives from 23 airlines regulatory agencies, crew member unions, and passenger advocacy groups had gathered for the first annual Air Travel Equity Summit, an event that had evolved from the Jackson Initiative into an industry-wide movement. Alexander Jackson stood at the podium surveying the diverse assembly with measured satisfaction. 1 year ago, a single incident exposed patterns of discrimination that had persisted throughout commercial aviation for decades. Today, we gather not to celebrate how far we've come, but to honestly assess our progress and chart the course ahead. The data presented throughout the morning sessions told a compelling story of transformation in progress. 17 major airlines had implemented standardized discrimination reporting protocols, resulting in a 340% increase in documented incidents, not because discrimination had increased, but because it was no longer being suppressed or reclassified. "Transparency is the foundation of accountability," explained Sophia Ramirez, now recognized throughout the industry for her leadership of Montgomery's Passenger Equity and Crew Advocacy Division. These numbers may appear alarming, but they represent progress, the conversion of invisible patterns into visible data that can drive meaningful change. The summit featured panel discussions with flight attendants sharing previously silenced experiences, executives discussing implementation challenges, and passenger representatives providing perspective on the traveler experience. Throughout, a common theme emerged: the shift from viewing equity as a public relations concern to recognizing it as an operational priority. Thomas Brooks, whose Horizon Telecommunications had developed the industry's first passenger equity rating system, presented preliminary findings from the initial assessment cycle. Airlines that have fully implemented reformed practices are seeing significant improvements in crew retention, reduced in-flight incidents, and perhaps most surprisingly to some increased customer satisfaction across all cabin classes, he reported. This contradicts the long-held assumption that enabling discriminatory behavior from premium passengers somehow enhances their experience. In a session focused on crew empowerment, Michael Wilson made an unexpected appearance. Following his testimony and separation from Montgomery Airlines, he had become an advocate for culture change within aviation, working with smaller regional carriers to implement lessons learned from his experience. "I spent 15 years enabling a system I knew was wrong," he admitted candidly. "The hardest part of transformation is acknowledging that complicity, recognizing that neutrality in the face of discrimination is itself a form of support for the status quo." As the day progressed, attention turned to forward-looking initiatives. Elena Rivera of Suncoast Airlines announced an industry-first demographic transparency report documenting the representation of women and people of color across service positions from flight attendants and pilots to executives and board members. "We cannot address inequity without first understanding where it exists structurally," Elena explained. "This baseline data will allow us to measure progress not just in passenger treatment, but in who makes decisions about airline policies and priorities." The afternoon featured a special presentation on educational initiatives, highlighting the unexpected alliance between the Jackson Initiative and the Windsor Accountability Project. Dominique, now 17 and preparing for her senior year of high school, joined Amanda Windsor on stage to discuss their complementary approaches. While the Jackson Initiative focuses on protecting those experiencing discrimination, the Windsor Project addresses the sources of discriminatory behavior, Dominique explained. Together, these efforts create a comprehensive approach to transformation. Amanda outlined the preliminary results from the Windsor Accountability Project's pilot program, which had engaged over 200 youths from privileged backgrounds in experiential learning about bias, privilege, and their real-world impacts. Preliminary assessments show significant shifts in awareness and behavior among participants, she reported. Perhaps most encouragingly, we're seeing these young people return to their families and communities as advocates for change, rather than perpetuators of problematic patterns. The summit concluded with Alexander announcing the expansion of the Natalie Jackson Scholarship Program, which would now support 50 students annually pursuing careers in aviation hospitality and civil rights law, a tenfold increase from its initial scope. Sustainable change requires not just reformed policies, but transformed leadership, he emphasized. These scholarships represent our investment in the next generation of industry leaders who will bring diverse perspectives to decisions that have historically been made from limited viewpoints. As attendees networked during the closing reception, Dominique found herself approached by a young flight attendant who introduced herself as Jasmine Torres. "I just wanted to thank you personally," Jasmine said earnestly. "I'm one of Sophia's new hires, and the changes implemented since what happened to you, they've completely transformed how I experience this job." "How so?" Dominique asked, genuinely interested. "I don't have to pretend not to notice when passengers treat me differently because of my appearance," Jasmine explained. "There are actual consequences now, actual support structures. And knowing that leadership all the way up to your father prioritizes our dignity as much as passenger satisfaction. That changes everything about how I approach difficult situations." This personal testament to tangible change touched Dominique deeply. While industry reports and metrics were important, individual experiences like Jasmine's represented the human impact of the past year's transformation efforts. Later that evening, Alexander and Dominique shared a quiet dinner at home, reflecting on the summit and the year's progress. "Mom would be proud," Dominique observed absently, touching the silver wing pin she still wore daily. not just of the policies, but of how they're being implemented with actual accountability, not just promises. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. She always believed change was possible even when she was facing the worst discrimination. That's what made her extraordinary, her ability to maintain hope while confronting reality. "I've been thinking about college applications," Dominique said, changing the subject slightly. "I'm considering programs in organizational psychology or civil rights law." Alexander smiled, recognizing how profoundly the events of the past year had shaped his daughter's developing interests and aspirations. "Whatever you choose, you'll bring unique perspective shaped by everything you've experienced and observed, including watching you," Dominique acknowledged. "Seeing how you responded not defensively or performatively, but with genuine commitment to addressing root causes." As their conversation continued, Dominique shared her ongoing communication with Amanda, whose Windsor Accountability Project was gaining recognition in educational circles and being adapted for implementation in private schools across the country. "She's received an invitation to present at a conference on privilege and education next month," Dominique reported. "It's remarkable how she's transformed her family legacy from something shameful into a catalyst for positive change." "Much as you've done with your mother's experience," Alexander observed. "Taking something painful and creating purpose from it." The transformation blueprint developed over the past year extended far beyond corporate policies or even industry practices. It encompassed personal journeys like Amanda's evolution from beneficiary of privilege to advocate for accountability, institutional changes like Montgomery Airline's structural reforms, and cultural shifts in how discrimination was recognized and addressed. Yet both father and daughter recognized that the work remained incomplete. The increased transparency had revealed how deeply entrenched certain patterns were, and resistance to change persisted in pockets throughout the industry. Some airlines had embraced reforms sincerely. Others had implemented superficial changes while maintaining problematic practices beneath the surface. "This is generational work," Alexander acknowledged as they concluded their evening. "We've made meaningful progress, but true transformation will require sustained commitment over years, not months." Dominique nodded in agreement, her expression reflecting both satisfaction with what had been accomplished and determination regarding what remained to be done. At 17, she had already experienced both the painful reality of discrimination and the challenging possibility of creating change in response experiences that would shape her path forward, whatever specific direction she chose. As she prepared for bed that night, Dominique paused before the framed photograph of her mother in uniform that had resided on her nightstand since childhood. The image that had once represented primarily personal loss now carried additional layers of meaning, legacy, purpose, and the continuing journey toward a world where dignity was not determined by appearance or background, but recognized as the inherent right of every individual. The transformation blueprint was ambitious, yet practical, visionary, yet grounded in measurable actions. And while its full implementation would require ongoing effort beyond any single initiative or individual, the foundation had been firmly established, built from a moment of discrimination, transformed through determination into a movement for lasting change. The grand ballroom of the International Aviation Conference Center sparkled with camera flashes as industry leaders, government officials, and media representatives gathered for the milestone 5th anniversary of the Air Travel Equity Initiative. What had begun as the Jackson Initiative had evolved into a global standard for addressing discrimination in commercial transportation, with implementation across 147 airlines in 76 countries. At the podium stood Dominique Jackson, now 21, and in her final year at Georgetown University's Law Center. Her poised confidence reflected not just the poised teenager who had faced discrimination with dignity 5 years earlier, but the emerging leader she had become, articulate, thoughtful, and increasingly influential in her own right. 5 years ago, a torn uniform became an unexpected catalyst for examining patterns of discrimination that had persisted for decades. she began, her voice carrying the measured authority that reminded many of her father. Today we gather not to celebrate completion, but to acknowledge progress while recommitting to the work that remains. The statistics presented throughout the evening told a compelling story of transformation. Crew member retention had increased by 32% across participating airlines. Documented discrimination incidents had initially spiked as reporting improved, then steadily declined as accountability mechanisms took effect. Passenger satisfaction had improved across all cabin classes, contradicting early concerns that addressing discriminatory behavior might somehow diminish the premium travel experience. Perhaps most significantly, Dominique noted, the culture of silence has been replaced by a culture of accountability. 5 years ago, 78% of flight attendants reported having witnessed discrimination without feeling empowered to address it. Today, that number has dropped to 17%, still too high, but representing meaningful progress in creating environments where respect is normalized rather than exceptional. From his seat in the front row, Alexander Jackson watched his daughter with unmistakable pride. At 50, his temples now showed more silver than black, but his commanding presence remained unchanged. Beside him sat Thomas Brooks, now 65, and recently retired from Horizon Telecommunications, though he remained active as chairman emeritus of the Air Travel Equity Board. "She's remarkable," Thomas commented quietly. "Every bit her mother's daughter, but with her own distinctive voice." Alexander nodded in agreement. Natalie laid the foundation through her quiet persistence. Dominique is building something extraordinary on that foundation. The evening's program featured a series of presentations highlighting different aspects of the initiative's impact. Sofia Ramirez, whose promotion to executive vice president had made her one of the highest-ranking Latina executives in commercial aviation, presented findings from the comprehensive 5-year assessment of crew experiences. "The transformation extends beyond statistics," Sofia emphasized. "We're seeing fundamental shifts in how crew members experience their roles not as passive recipients of passenger behavior, but as empowered professionals responsible for maintaining respectful environments." Elena Rivera, whose leadership at Suncoast Airlines had established industry-leading practices for demographic transparency and inclusive hiring, presented compelling data on the business benefits of equitable practices. Airlines with the highest equity ratings have consistently outperformed their competitors in customer loyalty, employee retention, and even stock performance, Elena reported. The myth that enabling discriminatory behavior from high-value customers somehow benefits. The bottom line has been thoroughly debunked by 5 years of operational data. As the formal presentations concluded, Dominique returned to the podium to introduce the evening's final speaker, a surprise addition to the program that had been carefully guarded until this moment. 5 years ago, an unexpected alliance formed between two initiatives approaching the same challenge from different directions, she explained. The Windsor Accountability Project has become a powerful complement to the industry reforms we've implemented, addressing the root causes of discriminatory behavior rather than just its manifestations. Please welcome Amanda Windsor. Applause greeted Amanda as she joined Dominique at the podium. At 33, Amanda had transformed from the uncertain law student who had approached Dominique 5 years earlier into a recognized authority on privilege education and accountability. Her Windsor Accountability Project now operated in 17 countries, with programs ranging from early childhood education to corporate leadership training. When I first reached out to Dominique after my mother's arrest, I had no idea that conversation would lead to a global educational initiative, Amanda acknowledged. I simply knew that patterns of prejudice are transmitted generationally unless deliberately interrupted, and I felt responsible for ensuring my family name became associated with breaking that cycle rather than perpetuating it. The collaboration between the Jackson and Windsor initiatives had become a case study in complementary approaches to social transformation, one focused on institutional accountability, the other on individual awareness and behavior change. Today, I'm proud to announce the formal integration of these efforts through the establishment of the Equity in Transit Foundation, Amanda continued. This independent organization will coordinate implementation of the Jackson Protocol for Institutional Accountability and the Windsor Curriculum for Education and Prevention, creating a comprehensive approach to addressing discrimination in all forms of commercial transportation. The announcement generated enthusiastic response from the assembled guests, representing as it did the natural evolution of what had begun as separate responses to a single incident. As the formal program transitioned to a networking reception, Dominique found herself approached by an elegantly dressed woman who introduced herself as Gabriela Morales Rodriguez. "You probably don't remember me," Gabriela began, "but I was on Flight 447. I was 7 months pregnant and you helped me get comfortable in economy before everything happened with Ms. Windsor." "Of course I remember you," Dominique replied warmly. "You came forward to use the first-class lavatory during the confrontation." Gabriela nodded, surprised to be remembered. "I've followed your work since then. It's been extraordinary to witness how you've transformed that moment into this movement." She gestured to a young girl beside her about 4 years old. "This is my daughter Natalie, named partly after your mother, though I didn't know it at the time. I just knew I wanted her to have the same strength I saw in you that day." This unexpected connection touched Dominique deeply. While the institutional changes and policy reforms were important, these personal impacts the individual lives, influenced by how she had responded to discrimination, represented perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the past 5 years. Across the room, Thomas Brooks engaged in conversation with Michael Wilson, whose journey from reluctant enabler to active advocate had become another unexpected dimension of the initiative's impact. After providing key testimony in Heather Windsor's trial, Michael had committed himself to education and reform, working primarily with regional carriers, often overlooked in industry-wide initiatives. The smaller airlines often struggle most with implementation, Michael was explaining. They lack the resources of major carriers, but face the same challenges with discriminatory passenger behavior. "We're developing scaled approaches that maintain the core principles while acknowledging operational constraints." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of adaptive implementation we need for sustainable change. One size never fits all." Meanwhile, Alexander found himself in conversation with Elena Rivera, discussing the next frontier in their ongoing work. "We've made significant progress in commercial aviation," Elena observed, "but similar patterns exist throughout the hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, cruise lines. The methodologies we have developed could be adapted for these adjacent sectors." Alexander considered this thoughtfully. "You're right. The principles are transferable even if the specific implementation would need customization for different environments." "Dominique might be interested in exploring this expansion after she completes law school," Elena suggested. "Her perspective would be invaluable in adapting the framework for new contexts." As the evening progressed, the conversation gradually shifted from celebrating past achievements to envisioning future directions, expanding beyond aviation, adapting methodologies for different cultural contexts, developing more sophisticated metrics for measuring both quantitative and qualitative aspects of equity in commercial spaces. Near the end of the reception, Alexander found a quiet moment with his daughter. "Your mother would be beyond proud," he told her softly. "Not just of what's been accomplished, but of the person you've become in the process." Dominique smiled, the emotion evident in her eyes. "I still wear her wing pin every day," she said, touching the silver pin at her lapel. "It reminds me of why this matters, not just the policies and programs, but the human dignity behind them." As guests began to depart, many paused to speak personally with Dominique, sharing how the initiative had affected their organizations or their individual experiences as travelers or crew members. Each conversation reinforced the ripple effect of what had begun as a single incident, but had expanded into a movement with far-reaching impact. The transformation of the past 5 years hadn't erased discrimination entirely. Such deep-seated patterns resist complete eradication, but it had created accountability where there had been impunity, established processes where there had been silence, and fostered awareness where there had been denial. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that meaningful change was possible when trauma was channeled into constructive action, rather than allowed to perpetuate cycles of harm and response. For Dominique, standing at the threshold between her academic preparation and professional future, the evening represented both culmination and commencement, the formal recognition of what had been accomplished and the implicit challenge of what remained to be done. The torn uniform that had once represented humiliation had been transformed into a symbol of resilience, determination, and the possibility of creating meaningful change from moments of injustice. And in that transformation lay perhaps the most important lesson of the past 5 years, that how we respond to discrimination ultimately matters more than the fact of having experienced it. The executive conference room at Montgomery Airlines headquarters hummed with anticipation as the board of directors awaited the arrival of their newest executive. 5 years and 3 months after the incident on Flight 447, Dominique Jackson was about to formally join the company her father had built, and her mother had served not as the CEO's daughter, but as a qualified professional in her own right. At 21, with her law degree nearly complete, Dominique had accepted a groundbreaking role created specifically to build upon the foundation established by the Jackson Initiative. As the newly appointed Director of Equity and Justice, she would have oversight authority across all departments with the unprecedented power to review and potentially veto any policy or decision with implications for equitable treatment of passengers or staff. Alexander stood at the head of the conference table, addressing the assembled executives and board members. 5 years ago, a moment of discrimination on one of our flights catalyzed changes that have transformed not just Montgomery Airlines but commercial aviation globally. Today, we take the next logical step in that evolution by establishing equity and justice as core operational priorities rather than peripheral considerations. The door opened and Dominique entered poised, professional, and purposeful in a navy suit that subtly echoed both her mother's flight attendant uniform and the one that had been torn during that pivotal incident. The silver wing pin at her lapel caught the light as she took her place beside her father. "Thank you for this opportunity," she began, her voice steady and assured. "I accept this position with full awareness of both its responsibilities and its symbolic importance." The Director of Equity and Justice role represents our commitment to embedding these principles in every aspect of our operations, from hiring and promotion practices to passenger policies to corporate governance. Thomas Brooks, who had joined Montgomery's board following his retirement from Horizon Telecommunications, nodded approvingly. At 65, he had become a respected elder statesman in the industry, his advocacy for equity reinforced by the proven business benefits of reformed practices. As Dominique outlines her vision for this role, Thomas addressed his fellow board members. "I want to emphasize that this is not merely symbolic. The authority vested in this position represents our recognition that equity considerations must have equal weight with financial and operational priorities in our decision-making processes." Dominique proceeded to present her initial priorities, expanding the crew advocacy program to include ground staff and customer service representatives, developing more sophisticated metrics for measuring equitable treatment across passenger demographics, and creating educational partnerships with aviation training programs to ensure future industry professionals entered their careers with awareness and skills for maintaining respectful environments. Throughout her presentation, Dominique demonstrated the balanced perspective that had become her hallmark: pragmatic, without compromising principles, visionary, without losing sight of practical implementation challenges, and always focused on tangible improvements in human experience rather than abstract ideals or performative gestures. As the meeting concluded and board members offered their congratulations, Sofia Ramirez approached Dominique with unmistakable emotion in her expression. "Your mother would be amazed to see this day," she said softly. "When we flew together, the idea that a black woman would one day have this level of authority in a major airline, especially one who began by experiencing the same discrimination she faced, would have seemed impossible." "That's why representation matters," Dominique replied. "Not just for visibility, but for the perspective it brings to decision-making. Mom understood that intuitively even when she couldn't articulate it in corporate terms." Later that afternoon, as Dominique settled into her new office, a video call notification appeared on her screen. The name displayed Amanda Windsor brought a smile of recognition. "Perfect timing," Dominique greeted as Amanda's face appeared on the screen. "Just finishing my first official day." "How does it feel?" Amanda asked. "Coming full circle like this." "Surreal, honestly," Dominique admitted. 5 years ago, I was experiencing discrimination on a Montgomery flight. Today, I have the authority to rewrite the policies that allowed that discrimination to occur." Amanda nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of full circles, I have news that felt appropriate to share today of all days. My mother is being released next month." Heather Windsor had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison following her conviction, a term reduced slightly for good behavior. Her case had become a landmark in aviation law, establishing precedent for how discriminatory assault on flight crews would be prosecuted and sentenced. "How do you feel about her release?" Dominique asked carefully, aware of the complex emotions this must evoke for Amanda. "Conflicted," Amanda acknowledged honestly. "She's still my mother despite everything. But our recent communications suggest she remains unchanged in many ways. She views herself as a victim of circumstance rather than accepting responsibility for her actions and their consequences." "And you?" Dominique inquired. "How has this journey been for you?" Amanda's expression reflected the weight and wisdom gained through difficult personal reckoning. "Transformative. Painful, but necessary. Building the Windsor Accountability Project forced me to examine my own inherited prejudices in ways I might otherwise have avoided. I'd like to think I've broken the cycle, at least in my generation." Their conversation shifted to the ongoing collaboration between their respective initiatives, which had expanded beyond aviation to address discriminatory patterns in hotels, restaurants, and other service industries. The Windsor-Jackson methodology, as it had come to be known in educational circles, had proven adaptable across contexts where privilege and service intersected. As they concluded their call, Amanda offered a final reflection that captured the essence of their unlikely alliance. 5 years ago, your torn uniform became a symbol of injustice. Today, it represents the possibility of transformation, not just of policies, but of perspectives." That evening, Alexander and Dominique visited Natalie's grave together, a ritual they maintained on significant milestones. The headstone, elegant in its simplicity, bore the addition of a small bronze plaque installed on the 3rd anniversary of Flight 447. "Her legacy lives in skies made more just through her daughter's courage." I sometimes wonder if we would have uncovered those discriminatory patterns without the catalyst of what happened to you, Alexander mused as they stood before the grave. The airline had those practices for years even after I acquired it and implemented what I thought were comprehensive reforms. Sometimes it takes a visible incident to expose invisible patterns, Dominique replied. What matters isn't that it happened, but how we responded to it. Alexander nodded in agreement. Your response has been extraordinary, transforming a personal trauma into institutional change that benefits countless others. Not just my response, Dominique corrected gently. Our response. The Jackson Initiative succeeded because you were willing to acknowledge structural failures without defensiveness to use your position and resources for substantive reform rather than damage control. As they prepared to leave, Dominique placed a fresh bouquet beside the headstone, then touched her mother's name with quiet reverence. I understood what she faced in a different way after experiencing it myself, she reflected. But I also understood her strength in a deeper way, the dignity she maintained despite what she encountered daily. She would say you've exceeded her example, Alexander said with certainty. She addressed discrimination through individual resilience. You've addressed it through institutional transformation. Their drive home took them past the Montgomery Airlines Operations Center, where aircraft departed and arrived in carefully choreographed sequence, carrying thousands of passengers and crew members operating under policies and practices fundamentally different from those that had existed 5 years earlier. For Dominique, the torn uniform that had once represented humiliation had become something entirely different, a catalyst for change, a symbol of resilience, and ultimately a beginning rather than an ending. The fabric had been ripped, but what had emerged from that moment was stronger, more purposeful, and more enduring than what had been damaged. As she prepared for her second day as Director of Equity and Justice, Dominique reflected on the journey from that first-class cabin to the executive suite, not a path she would have chosen, but one she had navigated with the same dignity her mother had modeled throughout her life. The discrimination she had faced hadn't defined her. Her response to it had. And in that response lay a legacy that extended far beyond one incident on one flight to touch countless lives across an entire industry transformed. The full circle wasn't just about Dominique's personal journey from victim to advocate to executive. It was about transforming a moment that could have reinforced patterns of injustice into a movement that challenged and changed those patterns, creating ripples that continued to expand outward, touching lives in ways that could never be fully measured, but would be felt for generations to come. Have you ever faced discrimination in a place where you were made to feel like you didn't belong? Dominique's story shows that dignity can be our greatest weapon when confronted with prejudice. It's not just about standing tall in difficult moments, but about channeling those experiences into meaningful change that benefits others. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives of courage and transformation. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they belong wherever they choose to stand. Remember, true strength isn't just about enduring injustice. It's about working to ensure others don't have to face the same battles. Comment below with your thoughts or experiences. Your voice matters, and together we can create spaces where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve.